had been planning the trip for months. It wasn't a vacation in the traditional sense. I didn't want beaches or cities or crowded campgrounds. I wanted a cabin deep in the woods, a place where the only sound would be the wind in the trees, the occasional snap of a branch, and the subtle rustle of animals in the underbrush. My life had become a blur of work emails, endless social obligations, and the constant pressure to perform, and I was desperate for solitude. I found a small cabin listed online, miles away from the nearest town, and booked it without hesitation. The pictures showed a modest log structure with a small porch, a stone fireplace, and a surrounding forest that seemed almost endless. The reviews mentioned the seclusion and the lack of cell service, which only made it more appealing. The drive there took longer than I expected. The last few miles were over dirt roads, winding and narrow, surrounded by thick forest. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon as I finally pulled into the small clearing where the cabin sat. The forest around it was dense and dark, the tall trees casting long shadows across the road. There was no one else in sight. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, sharp and clean, and I felt a mix of relief and tension settle into me as I stepped out of the car. Everything was silent except for the wind and the occasional creak of branches. The cabin itself was small, probably built decades ago, with wooden logs darkened by age and weather. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and the door squeaked when I opened it. Inside, the smell of old wood and a faint hint of mildew filled the air. The furniture was simple and functional. A small table, a couple of chairs, a sofa that looked firm but worn, and a bed with a thin mattress. The fireplace was cold, but I could see that it had been used recently. A stack of firewood was neatly piled nearby. The kitchen area was basic, with a small gas stove, a sink, and a few cupboards stocked with essential utensils. There was no Wi-Fi, and my phone barely registered a signal. I was cut off from the outside world, exactly how I wanted it. I spent the first few hours exploring the area around the cabin. The forest was thick, almost suffocating in its density, and the ground was uneven, covered in roots and moss. Birds chirped in the distance, and I saw small animals darting through the trees. I found a small creek not far from the cabin, its water clear and cold, and the sound of it running over rocks was calming. The sun disappeared completely by the time I returned to the cabin, leaving the clearing bathed in deep twilight. I lit the fireplace, enjoying the warmth and the flickering shadows it cast against the walls. That night, I slept lightly, partly because I was unused to the isolation and partly because of the strange noises outside. There were sounds that I couldn't identify, branches snapping, something moving in the underbrush, the occasional low growl or rustle. I told myself it was animals, probably deer or raccoons, but I couldn't shake a persistent sense of unease. When I woke, the forest outside was quiet and still, almost unnaturally so. The second day was bright and clear, and I spent most of it hiking along the trails I discovered the day before. I kept telling myself I was just enjoying nature, clearing my mind, but the feeling of being watched kept creeping in. I started noticing little details, footprints that didn't belong to any animal I recognized, the sound of twigs snapping behind me when I was sure I was alone, glimpses of movement between trees that disappeared when I tried to focus on them. I began keeping a small knife in my pocket and a lighter in my hand, not because I expected trouble, but because my instincts told me to be cautious. On the third day, things started to feel different. It began with subtle changes. A bird that didn't flee when I approached, footprints that seemed too large for any deer, the smell of something faintly metallic in the air. I was still telling myself it was my imagination. I was alone after all, but the feeling didn't go away. That evening, while gathering firewood, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the rustle of leaves or an animal moving through underbrush. It was deliberate, slow, crunching footsteps approaching from the woods. I froze, listening. The steps stopped, and the forest went silent again. I couldn't see anything, but I had the overwhelming sensation that someone, or something, was out there, watching. I locked the cabin door and bolted the windows, even though I knew it probably wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in. I kept the fireplace burning, the flickering light casting strange shadows, making the cabin feel both safer and more claustrophobic. That night, sleep was impossible. Every small noise made my heart race. The wind rattling the roof, the creak in the distance, the faint snapping of a branch that sounded far too deliberate. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the knife and listening. The next morning, I found evidence that my fears weren't just in my mind. On the porch, faint footprints pressed into the soft dirt, large and irregular, like someone had circled the cabin in the night. I hadn't left the cabin, and there was no one else in sight. Panic began to creep in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I packed the essentials: water, some food, my flashlight, and the knife, and decided to hike toward the nearest road. I knew it was a long shot. The nearest town was miles away, and the forest was dense, but I couldn't stay where I was. The hike was grueling. The forest seemed endless, each tree blending into the next, each turn in the trail feeling like it led deeper into isolation rather than toward safety. The sun was high, but it barely penetrated the thick canopy above. My legs ached, and my pack felt heavy, but I pushed on, driven by a mix of fear and determination. I kept hearing sounds, branches snapping behind me, leaves rustling, but when I turned, there was nothing. My mind was starting to play tricks on me, and I had to fight against the rising panic. As evening approached, I realized I was hopelessly lost. The forest had changed. Familiar landmarks were gone. I stopped to rest near a small clearing, my heart racing. That's when I saw it. A figure partially hidden among the trees watching me. I froze. It didn't move, but the presence was undeniable. My mind screamed to run, but I knew the forest was thick and uneven, and if I ran blindly, I could fall or break an ankle. I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes fixed on the figure until it disappeared into the shadows. When I finally reached the car, relief washed over me. I checked the doors, locked them, and started the engine. The first moments of driving felt surreal. The engine noise, the movement of the wheels on gravel, the lightning sky. I did not stop until I was back on a paved road, cell service fully restored, and finally able to breathe freely. My pulse began to slow. I knew that whatever had been out there was still in the woods, and I was lucky to have escaped without a confrontation. Later, I learned from a local ranger that the area was occasionally used by illegal hunters, and there had been reports of people following cabins to scout them for robbery. It explained the tracks, the pacing outside, and the careful observation I had sensed. Knowing that fact didn't erase the fear, but it made sense. Confirmed that my instincts had been correct. By the time I returned home, I had decided never to go back to that cabin. I was grateful for the experience in a strange, twisted way. It reminded me of the fragility of isolation, how vulnerable a person is when they are truly alone, and how quickly excitement and peace can turn into fear. I also learned to trust my instincts, to respect the wilderness, and to respect the presence of other humans, who are sometimes the greatest threat in a remote place. The trip left me shaken but wiser. I began to plan my future trips differently. Safer routes, more communication, and always letting someone know where I would be. I never forgot the sound of the footsteps circling the cabin, the way the shadows shifted in the firelight, and the realization that being alone in the forest was not as simple as it seemed. The fear was real, but the ending was clear. I survived, I learned, and I escaped. That experience changed the way I approached solitude, safety, and the quiet spaces I once craved. I had been planning this cabin trip for months, ever since I had stumbled across the listing online. It was described as a remote cabin in the mountains, off the main roads, far from any town or neighbor. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. Work had been consuming every part of my life, leaving me tense and exhausted, and the thought of disappearing into the woods, with only the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional bird, was irresistible. I told myself I needed it, that a weekend away alone in nature would restore some balance to my life, and I was determined to make it happen. The drive there was long. I left early in the morning, the sky a dull gray with clouds pressing low against the horizon. My GPS kept losing signal as I drove deeper into the mountains, the pavement giving way to gravel, and then dirt roads that twisted around steep slopes and through dense forests. Occasionally, I passed a single house or a small farm, but more often it was just trees on every side, dark and thick, their branches brushing against the side of the car. The deeper I went, the more my excitement was tinged with unease. It wasn't fear, exactly, more of an awareness that I was leaving the familiar behind and entering a space where help would be far away. By late afternoon, I reached the cabin. It was smaller than I had imagined. A simple wooden structure with a steep roof, darkened by age and weather. A thin wisp of smoke curled lazily from the chimney, though no one greeted me, and the door was unlocked. Inside, it smelled faintly of pine, dust, and old wood. The interior was modest. A small kitchen with a wood stove, a living area with a threadbare rug, a few chairs, and a narrow loft that served as a bedroom. There was running water, but no electricity except for a single generator that I would need to start manually if I wanted light. I spent the first hour unpacking, laying out my sleeping bag, organizing my food, and checking that everything I had brought was in working order. I stacked firewood neatly next to the stove, knowing I would need it when night fell. I could hear the forest outside, the wind rattling branches, leaves scraping across the roof, and somewhere in the distance, the faint call of a hawk. The isolation felt strange at first, but as I moved about the cabin, the quiet began to settle into me. I felt a calm I hadn't known in months. As the sun dipped lower, I decided to take a short walk around the immediate area. The cabin sat on a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by tall pines and thick underbrush. The ground was damp from an earlier rain, soft and spongy under my boots. I followed a narrow path I had noticed, just enough to keep me close, taking in the forest smells, the shadows growing long and dark. I noticed the way the wind pushed through the trees, how some branches groaned under the weight of their own movement. I felt a fleeting sense of being watched, though I knew it was just the imagination playing tricks in the dim light. I shook my head, laughed softly at myself, and returned to the cabin. Night fell faster than I expected. I lit a fire in the stove, its warmth filling the small space. Outside, the darkness was complete. No moon, no stars, just black. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending the branches outside scraping against the walls. I had brought a lantern, but I left it unlit, wanting to see how the cabin felt without any artificial light. The shadows seemed alive, moving as the fire flickered, stretching across the floor and walls. It was an eerie feeling, but not unpleasant. I had read enough about being in the wilderness to know that the mind can exaggerate shadows and shapes when it's isolated in darkness. As I settled in near the fire with a cup of coffee, I heard it, a low, persistent scratching at the side of the cabin. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it repeated, slow and deliberate. I froze, listening carefully. My first thought was a raccoon or some small animal. The scratching continued, sometimes stopping for a few seconds, then starting again in a different spot. It came from the side of the cabin, the corner closest to the trees. My stomach tightened. I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The wind hit me immediately, cold and damp, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine needles. I circled the cabin slowly, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The ground was soft, muddy from the rain. I saw footprints, small, too small to be human, but then, moving closer to the trees, there were larger prints. Deep, wide, unmistakably human. My heart started to race. I scanned the tree line with the light, but all I could see were the shadows of the trees, shifting in the wind. I returned inside, shutting the door carefully and bolting it. My hands were shaking, and I realized how utterly alone I was. No neighbors, no passing cars, no one to call except for the weak cell signal I occasionally caught near the loft window. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that humans weren't likely out here. But the footprints I had seen close enough to the cabin suggested otherwise. I sat near the fire, firewood ready, and kept the flashlight beside me. Every creak of the cabin, every thump from outside, made my heart jump. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. The scratching didn't return, but other sounds filled the night. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, heavy footsteps on the wet ground. Sometimes it sounded like someone pacing, sometimes like someone circling the cabin. I considered the possibility of a lost hiker or a hunter, though there was no reason for anyone to be here at this hour. The rational part of my mind tried to take over, to dismiss the noises as animals or wind. But another part, deeper and older, recognized real danger. I realized how exposed I was. By early morning, exhaustion had begun to blur my fear. I slept for a short time, sitting upright against the wall with the flashlight at hand. When I woke, the forest was gray, mist curling among the trees. I inspected the perimeter again. The footprints were still there, close to the edge of the clearing, but they had not moved closer overnight. Whoever had been there had not tried to enter the cabin while I slept. I decided to leave that morning, to break my isolation before it became something dangerous. I packed quickly, but before I could leave, I noticed something new. A line of small, broken branches leading from the treeline toward the cabin. It was subtle but deliberate. Whoever or whatever had come near had been moving closer. I felt a chill run down my spine. I realized that the person had been studying the cabin, waiting, or maybe trying to track me. The thought of walking alone down the dirt roads in that forest made me hesitate. I grabbed my backpack, checking my supplies, and made a plan. I would leave immediately but take the path I had arrived by, staying on the main road as soon as possible. I moved cautiously, scanning the forest around me, listening for any signs of movement. The silence was heavy, oppressive. Each step I took toward the car felt dangerous. The forest seemed alive, every shadow a possible threat. Over the next few days, I contacted local authorities. I learned that the forest had occasionally been used by squatters and occasional thieves, though rarely violent. No one had been reported missing recently. The traces I had seen, footprints, the moved logs, the sounds outside the cabin, were consistent with someone trying to scare or intimidate a person in isolation. They had no doubt been watching me, likely hiding nearby for hours. I reported the incidents, giving the exact location of the cabin, and the police patrolled the area for a week afterward. They didn't find anyone. I later read about similar occurrences in remote cabins. People targeting isolated travelers, testing whether they could control or terrorize them, but rarely physically harming anyone. Looking back, the fear I felt wasn't from ghosts or legends. It was real, physical, from someone human with intent. The isolation of the cabin, the forest, the lack of immediate help, it all made a person vulnerable. I realized afterward that my preparations had saved me. The flashlight, the axe, keeping my mind alert. I also realized that the woods were only peaceful if you respected them, but even then, human threats existed where you least expected. I didn't return to that cabin or that forest. I found a different area for future trips, closer to towns, where help could reach me if needed. I still hike alone sometimes, but I always check the surroundings, note the trails, and avoid isolation. It was an experience that left me shaken, but it also taught me vigilance, careful planning, and the reality that fear in the wilderness could be tangible, human, and dangerous. And surviving it meant staying alert, prepared, and calm under pressure. I still remember the sound of the knocks, the shifting firewood, the shadows that weren't mine. And I remember the relief when the forest finally released me, letting me reach the road, letting me breathe again. The fear never fully leaves, but now it's tempered by the knowledge that with caution and preparation, survival is possible, even when danger is unseen, silent, and close. The tracks led me to a small clearing not far from the cabin. There, I found something that made my stomach turn. A small campsite had been set up recently. The ashes in the fire pit were still warm. A few scraps of food and a blanket lay around. Someone had been living here, hiding in the woods, possibly watching the cabin for days. I realized then just how vulnerable I was. I turned back to head to the cabin, and every rustle in the leaves made me flinch. When I returned, I decided I needed to leave immediately. I packed everything I could into the car, trying to move quickly but quietly. That's when I saw movement in the trees near the cabin. The figure crouched low, watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed my bag, ran to the car, and locked the doors. The figure stayed still, almost blending into the trees. I started the car, my hands shaking, and drove off slowly at first, then faster as I gained distance. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, and even then, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. The figure was gone. The drive back to town was long and tense. Every noise, every shadow outside the car made me flinch. By the time I reached a populated area, I was exhausted. My hands cramped from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. I found a hotel and checked in, still trembling, and called the police to report what I had seen. They took the report, but there wasn't much they could do. By the time I fell asleep, I felt the weight of what had happened pressing on me. I had been alone, isolated, and someone had been living in the woods watching the cabin. That realization stuck with me long after I left. In the days after, I avoided the area completely. I couldn't stop thinking about how close someone had been. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful in the pictures and the daylight, had been hiding someone who had been silent, patient, and deliberate. The sense of vulnerability stayed with me for weeks. I couldn't sleep without checking locks, and every rustle outside my apartment made me tense. Eventually, life returned to normal, but I never forgot the cabin. I realized that isolation is a double-edged sword. The peace you seek can be a trap if someone else is sharing the space without your knowledge. I never went back, and I warned anyone I knew to avoid that area. The fear I felt that night wasn't from ghosts or legends. It was real, tangible, and entirely human. Months later, I learned that the area near the cabin had been frequented by a drifter, someone living off the grid, moving silently through the forest, watching the few people who dared to go into the woods. The police had found his campsite, abandoned, but signs of someone observing the cabin remained. I had been lucky, very lucky. The experience left me with a deep respect for being alone in remote areas. Not because of stories, not because of myths, but because real danger, quiet and patient, can exist where you least expect it. I never returned to a cabin in the woods alone again, but the lesson stayed with me. Isolation can be beautiful, but it can also be terrifying, and the line between the two can be razor thin. I decided to make a break for it, but I needed to be smart. I waited until the morning fog was thick, giving me cover, and then moved slowly toward the main road. I stayed low, using trees and underbrush for concealment, listening for any sign of pursuit. Hours passed. The fog began to lift, and the road came into view. I could see tire tracks in the dirt, but no cars. Relief mixed with caution. I still wasn't sure if they were nearby. When I finally reached the highway, I moved quickly to flag down a passing car. The first vehicle that stopped was a truck, and I jumped in without hesitation. The driver looked surprised but didn't ask questions as I explained briefly that I had been stuck in the woods and someone had been following me. He didn't need details. We drove for what felt like forever, and I watched the forest disappear behind me. I called the police once I reached a town with service. They logged a report, but given the remoteness of the location and the lack of evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Still, knowing someone would at least be aware of my situation provided a strange sense of closure. I never went back to that cabin, and I never looked for a remote getaway in the forest again. What stayed with me most wasn't the fear itself, but the sense of vulnerability, the realization that isolation can quickly turn from peaceful to dangerous. I had been lucky, careful in the end, and aware of my surroundings. But the thought of what could have happened if I had been less alert haunted me for months. Every shadow, every sound, every subtle movement in the periphery of my vision reminded me of that weekend. It changed the way I approached solitude, caution, and trust in places far from help. I had survived, but it was a stark, lasting lesson. Nature is beautiful, but it can also be indifferent, and human threat is always a possibility in isolation. I still remember the forest, the cabin, the creek. I remember the way the shadows moved, the way the night sounded, and the way panic felt crawling up my spine like ice. And I remember the relief of finally reaching the road, of seeing other humans again, of knowing I had made it through without being caught. It wasn't a story of ghosts or fantasy. It was a story of reality, sharp, raw, and unrelenting. And it ended with survival, clear and tangible, a mix of fear, vigilance, and exhaustion, but with the certainty that I had made it through, alive and wiser for it. I never thought a simple weekend getaway could turn into something I would remember for the rest of my life. It started as a routine escape, a plan I made to get away from the noise of the city and the constant buzz of work. I had discovered a small cabin through an online listing, tucked deep in the forest, far from the nearest town. The description made it sound perfect. Isolated, quiet, with a small creek running behind it and a little wood deck that overlooked a clearing. I had imagined myself spending the weekend reading, hiking, and just being alone, free from the constant interruptions of my everyday life. I drove for hours, the roads getting narrower and rougher as I left the main highway behind. At some point, the asphalt gave way to gravel, then dirt, and the trees seemed to close in on either side of the path. The sky had been clear when I left the city, but now the sun was starting to sink, painting long shadows across the road. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, it was late afternoon, and the woods around me seemed alive with muted sounds. Birds called to one another, leaves rustled with the wind, and I could hear the faint trickle of water from the creek behind the cabin. The cabin itself was small, made of rough logs, and looked older than the listing had suggested. The wood was weathered, and some boards near the porch creaked under my weight as I stepped down from the car. I set my backpack and supplies down, noting the eerie silence that surrounded the place. The door opened easily, though it groaned on its hinges, and inside it smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic. There was basic furniture: a small table, 2 chairs, a cot in the corner, and a wood stove. It seemed clean enough, though clearly it hadn't been used much recently. I unpacked my things, set up a small sleeping area on the cot, and decided to explore the area before dark. The forest pressed in close on all sides. The creek ran just behind the cabin, shallow and slow, with rocks that had grown slick with moss. I followed it upstream, noting the way the trees thinned here and there, creating small clearings where sunlight filtered through. It was peaceful in a way that city life could never be, but there was an underlying tension I couldn't shake. There were no other signs of human life. No trails, no footprints, nothing. Even the sounds of the forest seemed muted compared to what I expected. It was beautiful, yes, but unnervingly so. I returned to the cabin before nightfall, making a small fire in the stove. The light flickered across the walls, casting shadows that seemed larger than they should have been. I ate a quick dinner I had brought, then tried to relax. The quiet outside was almost complete now, interrupted only by occasional animal sounds that seemed distant. I thought about going to bed early, but something made me linger near the window, looking out into the darkening forest. That's when I noticed movement, a shape, barely visible, flitting between the trees. My first thought was that it was an animal, a deer maybe, but the way it moved didn't feel right. It was too deliberate, too cautious, as if it were watching me as much as I was watching it. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a raccoon or some other nocturnal animal. I went to bed but found sleep difficult. Every small sound made me startle. The wind rattling the window, the creek's water hitting rocks, the soft creak of the cabin settling. Hours passed and I dozed lightly, waking every time I thought I heard something more distinct. Footsteps on the porch, the snap of a branch close to the cabin. I kept telling myself it was my imagination. Eventually, I drifted into a light sleep, only to be awakened by a loud thump against the door. I froze, straining to hear. Another thump followed, heavier this time. I wasn't alone. The rational part of my mind wanted to say it was a falling branch or the wind, but my gut screamed otherwise. I grabbed the small flashlight I had, careful not to make sudden movements, and shined it out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the trees. I waited, heart hammering, and then another sound, closer this time, coming from the side of the cabin. Someone or something was moving around the building. Panic set in, sharp and cold. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and moved to the back door, thinking I might have to defend myself. The steps outside were slow, deliberate, almost methodical. Whoever it was knew I was awake. My mind raced. How had they found this place? How had I not seen them approach? I remembered leaving my car unlocked. Maybe they had followed me from the road. I cursed my carelessness. Then the steps stopped. Silence again, but heavier this time, as if the forest itself was waiting. I backed into the cabin, considering my options. There was a small window in the kitchen, but it was locked and didn't open easily. The front door was the only exit, and if I went out, I would be exposed. I decided the best course was to stay inside and wait. I moved quietly, making sure the knife was in front of me, and listened. Hours passed. The sounds came and went, sometimes close, sometimes further away, but always deliberate. Whoever, or whatever, was outside seemed to be testing me, seeing how I would react. I thought about calling for help, but my phone had no signal, of course, and there was no one for miles. I remembered the small road I had driven in on, but it was dark and treacherous. There was no way I could get out safely without being seen. I tried to stay calm. I checked the doors and windows again, double-locked them, and moved the furniture slightly in front of the entrances. The hours stretched on like days, each sound amplified in the darkness. I could feel my hands trembling, my chest tight, every muscle tense. I stayed awake most of the night, barely sleeping, listening to every crack of wood, every shift of leaves, every distant animal call. By morning, exhaustion had set in. I realized that if I stayed, I would continue to be trapped in fear, waiting for something that might never come, or might come in a way I couldn't defend against. I needed a plan, a careful, measured plan. The first light of dawn illuminated the clearing, giving me a view of the surrounding woods. I grabbed my backpack, filling it with essentials: water, food, flashlight, and the knife. I noticed tracks in the mud leading away from the cabin. They were too large to be from an animal. Someone had been circling the cabin. The next morning, I inspected the perimeter. There were new footprints, larger this time, leading away from the cabin into the trees. I followed them cautiously for a short distance but found nothing. Whoever had been there had vanished. The realization made me both anxious and relieved. They hadn't broken in, hadn't threatened me directly. But the idea that someone had been outside while I slept, watching, left me unsettled. I spent the day keeping busy, cleaning, checking the locks, hiking only along the cabin trail. Every shadow made me jump. Every rustle of leaves had my heart in my throat. I knew I needed to stay calm, to maintain reason. Could be a lost hiker, a local checking on the property, anyone. But the fear was hard to shake. That night, I prepared for the worst. I moved a chair to block the front door, put a heavy kitchen knife within reach, and arranged the flashlight beside me. I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I heard it again. Scratching, footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. But this time I stayed calm. I didn't react immediately. I waited, listening, watching. The scratching moved to the back of the cabin, then paused. Long minutes passed. I realized that whoever it was had stopped at the rear window. The glass was old, slightly fogged, but I could see a shadow, a figure crouched, moving cautiously. I held my breath, waiting. The figure stayed there for perhaps a minute, then moved away, disappearing into the trees. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but also relief. I wasn't directly attacked. Whoever it was had simply been curious or cautious. The next morning, I decided it was time to leave. I packed quickly, checking every corner of the cabin one last time. As I drove down the winding road back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes following me, of the forest being alive in a way that made me feel small and exposed. But with each mile, the tension eased, replaced by the warmth of the sun and the familiar sense of the open road. Back in the city, I reflected on the experience. The cabin had been everything I wanted: quiet, isolated, a break from the constant noise of modern life. But it had also been terrifying in ways I hadn't anticipated. Isolation amplifies fear, even rational fear. The footprints, the scratching, the feeling of being watched. They were all ordinary things in a normal world, but in that setting, they became something else entirely. I never returned to that cabin, but I learned something valuable from the experience. I learned to respect the power of solitude and the unpredictability of nature. I learned that fear isn't always about danger. It's about uncertainty, about the unknown. And I learned that I was capable of handling fear without panicking, of observing, assessing, and responding calmly. That realization, more than anything else, was the real reward of my trip. Even months later, when I walked through crowded streets or sat in a noisy cafe, I could feel the echo of that cabin. I could remember the smell of wet pine, the texture of the rough wood, the quiet pressure of being truly alone. And while it had been terrifying, it had also been grounding. It reminded me that fear is natural, but so is resilience. That night in the cabin, listening to the wind and the footsteps, I had faced fear directly. I had survived it, and I had come away stronger, more aware of my surroundings, and more in tune with myself. The forest outside that cabin remained a mystery. The figure who had circled the cabin remained unknown, and the isolation remained profound. But I carried the experience with me, a reminder that even in fear, clarity is possible. Life is full of unexpected encounters, some frightening, some confusing, and some that simply test our courage. That cabin, with all its fear and quiet terror, had tested mine, and I had passed. I had always liked being alone in the woods. The peace of nature, the smell of pine needles underfoot, the distant murmur of a stream, it all made the world feel simpler. That weekend, I decided to go further than usual, renting a small cabin tucked away in a dense forest a few hours' drive from the nearest town. The cabin was old but solid, built from heavy logs that had darkened with age, its roof shingled and mossy, windows thick and slightly fogged from years of weather. It sat at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees that bent and swayed with the wind. The air smelled damp and earthy, thick with the scent of wet leaves and soil. When I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The gravel road that led to the cabin had been overgrown in parts, and my car bumped along, tires crunching against stones and dirt. I parked near the cabin, opened the trunk, and started unloading supplies. Food, water, firewood, and a few essentials. I carried everything inside, noting how quiet it was. The only sounds the creak of the cabin floor and the occasional thump of a loose shutter against the wall. I set up my small fire in the stone hearth, stacking wood neatly. I checked the windows and doors, all sturdy and locked. Everything seemed normal, but the silence felt heavier than I expected. Not the kind of silence that calms you, but the kind that feels watched, like the air itself was waiting. The first night was restless. The wind whispered through the trees, rattling the cabin like it was alive. Occasionally, I thought I heard movement outside, a branch breaking under some weight. I tried to tell myself it was a deer or some small animal, nothing more. I kept the fire going, not just for warmth but to feel a line of comfort between me and the forest. The glow made the shadows in the corners dance, twisting into shapes that I knew were illusions. Still, sleep came in brief, uneasy patches, dreams jagged and filled with muffled sounds that seemed too real. In the morning, I told myself I was being paranoid. The forest was old, the cabin was old, and old things creak and groan for no reason other than age. I spent the next day exploring the nearby trails. The forest opened into a series of ridges and dips, a small creek that trickled along rocks, fallen trees covered in moss. Birds flitted overhead, squirrels chattered in the distance. I noted a faint trail off the main path that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Something about it made me pause. It was unnaturally silent compared to the rest of the forest. No birds, no wind through leaves, just an empty quiet that pressed on my ears. I shook it off, telling myself curiosity would be fine, and decided to circle back. I wasn't the kind to wander aimlessly, and the forest, beautiful as it was, could be dangerous if I got lost. That night, the cabin felt different. I don't know how to describe it other than that the walls seemed closer, the shadows deeper. I had set up my sleeping bag on the floor near the fire, a habit I had when I was alone in the wilderness. Around midnight, I woke to a sound. A faint scuffing, soft but deliberate, coming from the side of the cabin. My heart jumped, and I froze, straining to hear. The wind could have been moving debris, branches brushing against the wall, anything, but this sounded sharper, more intentional. I grabbed the flashlight I kept on the floor and aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the cabin's exterior wall and the edge of the clearing beyond. The sound stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, fire low but still burning, ears straining. By morning, the unease had not left me. I found myself checking the locks repeatedly, looking at the windows, walking around the perimeter to make sure nothing had changed. Everything looked fine, but my mind refused to quiet. I tried to go for another hike, hoping movement and daylight would calm me. As I walked the forest paths, I noticed things I hadn't seen the day before. Disturbed soil near the trail, broken twigs that looked like someone had stepped on them, faint footprints that seemed human, but too small and irregular to be consistent. My stomach sank. The thought that I might not be alone in the forest began to take root. Still, I told myself it was unlikely anyone else would be here. The area was remote, and I had all the gear I needed if something went wrong. I tried to stay calm, noting the details. The footprints were fresh, no more than a few hours old, leading to the east before disappearing. Maybe a hunter? Maybe someone lost? I didn't know, but I returned to the cabin more alert than ever. That evening, I prepared a meal, lighting the stove inside the cabin. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the usual night sounds muted. I finished eating and cleaned up, then checked my supplies. I kept a pocket knife within reach, along with my flashlight and a small axe I had brought for chopping wood. The scuffing noises from last night didn't return, but every small sound, the crack of a branch outside, a gust of wind, made me tense. Around midnight, I heard it again. A knock, soft and slow, on the cabin's door. My stomach turned. I didn't move at first, just listening. Another knock, deliberate and firm. Whoever it was didn't announce themselves, didn't speak. Just the rhythm of someone testing the door. I gripped the axe, shining the flashlight through the window. Nothing. No shadow, no figure. I considered calling for help, but I had no cell signal. My mind raced. Someone lost? Someone dangerous? A break-in attempt? I stayed awake the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, every creak and rustle setting my nerves on edge. The next morning, I noticed subtle changes. The firewood I had stacked outside was slightly shifted. Some logs moved from their original positions. Footprints led from the edge of the clearing to the cabin, small, human, cautious. I realized then that someone had been watching me, following me at a distance. The forest was supposed to be empty. I felt my control over the situation slipping. I packed essential supplies quickly, leaving the less necessary items behind. I tried to drive to the main road, but when I got to the gravel path, it was blocked by a fallen tree. Not old, not decayed. Someone had cut it down recently. Panic started to rise in my chest. I considered returning to the cabin, but I knew that wasn't safe. I had to move. I backtracked, scanning the forest, hearing footsteps that weren't mine, the snapping of branches that echoed around me. Every shadow looked like a figure. Every rustle was a potential threat. By midday, I found a small, unmarked logging road that led back toward the main highway. I ran, not walking, carrying only my essentials. Behind me, I could hear someone following, but I dared not look. My heart pounded, my legs burned. I felt the weight of the forest pressing down, closing in. I reached my car after what felt like hours. The doors were locked, but I had left a spare key under the bumper in case of emergencies. I got in, started the engine, and drove slowly at first, watching the treeline. The forest felt like it was watching me, every tree a potential hiding spot. As I drove, the sound of someone breaking through underbrush behind me made me floor the accelerator. Gravel flew, my tires slid, but I kept moving, shaking, hyper-aware of every shadow, every sound. Eventually, the forest thinned, the sun breaking through trees, and I reached the highway. Relief washed over me in heavy waves. I pulled over at a gas station to catch my breath, shaking so hard I could barely fill my water bottle. I had been looking forward to a week in the woods for months. My life in the city had become exhausting, a blur of fluorescent lights, traffic, and constant noise. The small cabin I had rented was deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town, and the only way in or out was a narrow dirt road that wound through towering pines and thick underbrush. The cabin itself was modest, a single room with a loft, a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a bathroom with an old but functional shower. It sat on the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by trees so dense that in some places the sunlight barely touched the ground. I had chosen it specifically for the isolation. I wanted quiet, a chance to be alone with my thoughts, to let the forest swallow me up and make me feel small in a way the city never could. I arrived on a Saturday afternoon. The drive had been long, bumpy, and unnerving, though I had dismissed it as the normal anxiety that came with unfamiliar back roads. The last 10 miles had been particularly rough, the dirt road pocked with deep ruts and lined with trees so close together that my headlights barely cut through the shadows. When I finally saw the cabin, it was exactly what I expected. Rustic, solid, and standing like it had for decades. There was a small pile of firewood stacked against the side, and a wooden porch that creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, fresh and sharp in a way that made my lungs ache a little with relief. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. The furniture was old, rough-hewn wood, but clean. There was a small table near the kitchen, a single bed in the corner, and the loft above accessible by a narrow wooden ladder. I unpacked my things slowly, taking in the details of the room, the way the light fell across the floorboards, the faint smell of wood smoke lingering from previous visitors. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, and I could hear birds calling, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. I made a mental note of the firewood, lit a small fire in the stove, and settled in with a book. As night fell, the forest around me changed. Shadows stretched and twisted as the moon rose high above the treetops. The wind shifted, bringing with it strange creaks and groans from the old trees. I had spent nights in the wilderness before, but there was a certain tension that came with being completely alone. I ate a simple dinner of canned soup, washed it down with water from a filtered jug, and went to bed early, hoping that sleep would wash away the lingering unease. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound that made my blood run cold. At first, I wasn't sure what it was, just a low, dragging noise outside, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I froze, straining to listen, heart hammering in my chest. The sound came again, slower this time, deliberate, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the rhythm of the noise, the weight behind it, didn't match anything I had ever heard in the forest. It was deliberate, slow, close. I stayed still for a long time, trying to decide what to do. The cabin had shutters over the windows, and I remembered the small hunting knife I had brought with me, tucked into my backpack. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a large animal, maybe a raccoon dragging a branch or a log. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I checked the perimeter of the cabin. There were no obvious signs of any intruders, human or animal. The ground was soft from a recent rain, and the dirt showed no footprints other than my own. The drag marks I had heard the night before seemed to have vanished. I told myself I was imagining things, a product of too many hours alone and too little sleep. I decided to explore the area around the cabin to distract myself. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, deceptively calm. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the ground. I walked a short trail that led to a small stream nearby, the water clear and icy cold. Birds flitted from branch to branch, and small animals scurried in the underbrush. The sounds were normal, the rhythm of life continuing as if nothing had happened the night before. I gathered some more firewood while I was outside, stacking it neatly by the cabin for the coming nights. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The back door, which I had locked, was slightly ajar. My mind immediately went to worst-case scenarios. Had someone been here while I was walking? Had I been targeted in some way? The locks were simple, a basic latch and a key, and I was careful to check it before I left. I didn't see any other signs of forced entry. No footprints. No disturbances inside the cabin. Everything appeared untouched, as if the door had simply been left open. I checked the windows, the small loft, every corner of the cabin. Nothing seemed missing. Still, the unease lingered. I decided to spend the day inside, keeping the fire going, staying alert. I cleaned the cabin, arranged my things, and tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. But every little sound, the wind tapping against the roof, the distant call of a bird, the creak of the floorboards, made my heart jump. That evening, I prepared a simple dinner and sat by the fire, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. The sun set slowly, painting the forest in shades of gold and orange. I noticed that the shadows were longer now, stretching toward the cabin in strange, sharp angles. Night came quickly, and with it, the oppressive feeling that I was not alone. I stayed up much later than usual, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again, the dragging sound. Slow, heavy, outside. My stomach tightened, and I gripped the knife in my hand. I didn't move. The sound circled the cabin, sometimes stopping, sometimes starting again, but always moving. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, but something about the rhythm, the weight behind it, felt intentional, calculated. I realized then that I had never truly been alone in the forest before. Not like this. The next morning, I didn't sleep well. I spent hours checking the cabin, making sure every window and door was secure. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I considered leaving, driving back to the town, but I had come too far to give up. The remoteness that had drawn me here now felt like a trap. During the day, I tried to distract myself by exploring further into the forest. I found a narrow trail that led to a ridge overlooking the valley. From there, the view was breathtaking. Rolling hills, thick forest, a small lake glinting in the sunlight. I took pictures with my phone, marking my location on a map in case I needed to find my way back. I walked for hours, careful to stay on the trail, and eventually returned to the cabin exhausted, but relieved that I hadn't seen any signs of people nearby. That night, I reinforced the locks, placing heavy furniture against the doors and windows, and kept the knife close. The dragging sound returned, but this time I could hear other noises as well. Branches breaking, small rocks tumbling down the slope behind the cabin. I lay awake for hours, listening to the forest and imagining every possible scenario. The fear was intense, physical, making it hard to breathe. That night, the unease returned in full force. I had eaten a small meal, lit the stove, and tried to read a book, but my focus kept drifting to the window. There was something outside, something moving just beyond the clearing. I convinced myself it was a deer, maybe a fox, but then I heard it. A soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the dirt. Not random, not like an animal walking. Someone or something was walking around the cabin. My stomach tightened. I checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked and closed. I tried to listen carefully, pressing my ear against the window. The sound stopped. I waited, frozen, every muscle tense. Then, after a long pause, I heard it again. Footsteps circling, moving slowly, carefully. Whoever it was knew I was inside. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept the fire going, pacing the cabin, listening to the occasional sound outside. It was as if the forest itself had changed. The usual wind rustling and bird calls were gone, replaced by something deliberate, something watching. I considered leaving, but I was too far from the main road. If someone was outside, I had no way to know what they wanted. I told myself to remain calm, to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hiker, a hunter, someone lost like me. But the thought didn't ease my fear. By dawn, I was exhausted, jittery, and my mind was racing. I didn't want to leave, but I knew I needed to find a way to protect myself. The next day, I took inventory of what I had. I had a small hatchet, a kitchen knife, some matches, a few cans of food, and a limited supply of water. No phone signal, no way to call for help. I realized I needed to be proactive. I reinforced the doors as best I could, moving heavy furniture to block the main door and bracing the windows with chairs. I stayed alert, moving quietly around the cabin, listening for any sound outside. Hours passed. Nothing happened. I felt tense but slightly relieved. Maybe it had just been an animal. Maybe my fear had gotten the better of me. But that evening, the steps returned, louder this time, closer. Someone was clearly outside, walking along the perimeter of the cabin. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the hatchet, moving silently to the back window. There, I saw it. A figure, tall, dressed in dark clothes, moving deliberately. I froze, watching as the figure paused, turning slightly as if scanning the area. Panic hit me, sharp and cold. I had no way out, no way to call for help. I had to think fast. I remembered the creek I had passed the day before. If I could get there, maybe I could use it to obscure my movements, escape into the forest. But I had to wait until the figure left. The night was long. I stayed crouched by the window, heart pounding, clutching the hatchet, watching as the figure disappeared and returned intermittently. Couldn't sleep. I barely breathed. By early morning, the figure was gone, but I knew I couldn't stay. I spent hours packing what I could carry and making a plan. I would wait for daylight, then move toward the creek, keeping low and quiet. The forest was dense, but I knew it would provide cover. I left small items behind, just taking the essentials. Water, food, the hatchet, and my bag. I moved slowly, scanning constantly. The forest seemed endless, each tree a potential hiding place, each shadow a potential threat. I walked cautiously, never making noise, every step calculated. The creek finally appeared, and I followed it, hoping it would lead me to a road or a sign of civilization. Hours passed. The forest remained oppressive, thick, and unyielding, but following the creek gave me a sense of direction. I climbed over fallen logs, waded through shallow water, and avoided areas where the ground seemed unstable. My legs were sore, my arms scratched by branches, my skin wet and cold. The sun rose higher, and I began to feel slightly safer, knowing that the light would make me more visible if anyone were tracking me. Eventually, the creek widened, and I found signs of human activity. A faint trail, discarded cans, tire tracks in the mud. Relief washed over me. I was close to the road. I followed the trail, moving faster now, my body exhausted but my mind focused. After what felt like hours, the trees thinned, and I saw the road in the distance. A car passed by, and I waved frantically, shouting until the driver stopped. They called the authorities while I collapsed on the side of the road, trembling, soaked, and dirty. The police investigated the cabin. They found evidence that someone had been watching me for days, living quietly near the clearing. Tracks, makeshift shelters, discarded food. No one was caught immediately, but the area was secured. I learned later that it was a man who had been living off the forest, observing cabins, taking advantage of isolated travelers. The thought made my stomach turn. I had survived, yes, but it was terrifying to know how close I had come to something far worse. I returned to the city slowly, still shaken, replaying every detail in my mind. The cabin trip, meant to be a peaceful escape, had become a test of patience, caution, and survival. The memory of footsteps circling the cabin, the oppressive silence of the forest, and the isolation still haunted me. But I survived, and that knowledge, as terrifying as the experience was, gave me strength. I realized how vulnerable I was, how quickly calm can turn into fear, and how important preparation, awareness, and courage can be in moments when danger is close, silent, and invisible. In the end, the cabin trip taught me more than I expected. It taught me about limits, endurance, and the unexpected threats that can hide in places we consider safe. It taught me to respect the wilderness, not just for its beauty but for its unpredictability. And it taught me that even when trapped, with careful observation, planning, and calm determination, survival is possible. I never returned to that forest, but I carried the lessons with me. The fear didn't vanish overnight, but it faded, leaving behind a sharper sense of vigilance and respect for the world, and a deep understanding that danger can lurk anywhere, even in places that seem peaceful, quiet, and alone. I survived because I didn't panic. I survived because I acted, and that survival, every scratch, every sleepless hour, every step through the cold water, became a story of endurance, of facing fear head-on, and of ultimately returning to safety with my life intact. I had been planning this trip for months, and by the time I finally reached the cabin, I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. The drive through the winding forest roads had been long, and the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows between the tall pines. I had chosen this cabin for its isolation, a place far away from people, far from noise, a place where I could escape completely. The GPS had guided me through narrow, nearly impassable roads, and at times I wondered if I had taken a wrong turn. The tires crunched over gravel, and the occasional bird cry echoed eerily through the trees. By the time I arrived, the last traces of sunlight were fading, and the cabin looked even smaller and lonelier than it had in the pictures online. The cabin itself was an old, wooden structure, with weathered planks that had darkened over decades of rain and snow. Its windows were clouded with grime, and the chimney, though intact, looked unused for years. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and the wooden steps creaked under my weight. I parked my car to the side, leaving it partially hidden by a thick growth of bushes and small trees. My backpack was heavy, filled with food, water, extra clothing, and supplies for a week alone. I had double-checked everything before leaving home, making sure I was prepared for any situation. I had a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, a small axe, and enough firewood stacked neatly beside the cabin to last for days. Stepping inside, the air was musty, carrying the scent of damp wood and dust. I could see where water had seeped in along the edges of the ceiling, leaving dark streaks that ran like rivers down the walls. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I had to step carefully to avoid the weakest ones. I set my backpack down and ran my hands along the surfaces, checking for stability and anything that might have been broken. The cabin was empty, bare, except for a small kitchen area, a table with a few chairs, and a single bed in the corner covered with a threadbare blanket. There was an old wood-burning stove in the kitchen, its blackened metal surface showing years of use. I unpacked my things, lighting a small lantern to keep the shadows from swallowing the room entirely. Night fell quickly, faster than I had anticipated. The forest outside was almost completely dark, the trees forming an impenetrable wall. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin's wooden panels, and I could hear small animals scurrying in the underbrush. At first, it was comforting to hear life around me, to know that the forest was alive. But as the hours passed, the sounds became sharper, more deliberate. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. I reminded myself that I was alone by choice, and yet, a part of me was unsettled by the total absence of other humans. The nearest town was miles away, and I had no phone signal. I was completely isolated. I built a fire in the stove, the warmth spreading slowly through the small cabin. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. I ate a simple dinner, some canned food I had packed, and then sat near the fire with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The cabin felt alive in a strange way, as if it was observing me, responding to my presence. I tried to focus on reading a book, but my attention kept drifting to the windows. Every shadow outside seemed to move with intent. Every snapping branch sounded like a step approaching. I reminded myself that it was all natural, nothing sinister. Just the forest, just the wind. Around midnight, I was woken by a sudden, sharp noise from outside. It sounded like something heavy hitting the cabin. My heart jumped into my throat. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, a dull thud against the side wall. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously approached the window. Peering out into the dark, I could barely make out the shapes of trees, their trunks like black pillars against the faint moonlight. Nothing was moving. I stepped back, trying to calm myself. Perhaps it was a deer or a bear, I thought. But deep down, I knew that even large animals usually avoid humans. The thought gnawed at me, but I told myself to stay rational. I checked the locks on the door and windows, ensuring everything was secure, and returned to the fire, keeping it burning through the night. Sleep came fitfully, broken by the occasional sound of branches snapping or leaves rustling. At one point, I woke to the sound of footsteps around the cabin, slow and deliberate. My first instinct was fear, my mind conjuring every possible threat. I grabbed the axe I had left beside the bed, my hands shaking as I approached the window. Outside, there was nothing. I stayed by the window for what felt like hours, watching for any movement. When nothing appeared, I finally sank back into bed, clutching the axe like a lifeline. The next morning, I explored the area surrounding the cabin. The forest was dense, the ground littered with fallen branches and thick layers of pine needles. I noticed tracks around the cabin, large, uneven, almost human in shape, but I couldn't be sure. They seemed fresh, pressed deep into the damp earth. A knot of unease formed in my stomach, but I forced myself to think logically. The tracks could belong to a hunter, or perhaps a group of hikers who had passed nearby. I took note of their pattern, but I didn't follow them. The thought of leaving the cabin alone, unarmed, was too risky. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched persisted. Every noise, every shadow, seemed amplified. I started keeping the axe close, even during the day, and I reinforced the door with a heavy log I dragged from the firewood pile. I rationed my food carefully, knowing that leaving to find supplies wasn't an option. I tried to distract myself with chores, stacking firewood, cleaning the cabin, organizing supplies, but nothing could shake the constant tension in the air. The isolation, which I had once sought, now felt suffocating. On the fifth night, the predator struck in a way I hadn't anticipated. I was asleep, or pretending to be, as much as one can sleep in such fear, when I heard the door handle jiggle. Not a knock, not a soft tap. It was deliberate, a forceful turn of the handle. My pulse hit my throat, and I grabbed the axe. The door shook. I held my ground. Then the sound of glass breaking from the kitchen window. My mind raced. I had a choice: confront them or barricade and wait. I chose the latter. I pushed the table and chairs against the door and crouched low, breath shallow, waiting for daylight. Outside, I could hear movement, the crunch of boots in dirt, the scrape of metal. The predator was trying every entry point. Hours passed. My muscles ached. My arms shook from holding the barricade. My mind spinning in panic and adrenaline. Then the dawn. Light filtered through the windows, weak but sufficient. The noises stopped. Silence returned. I didn't move immediately, afraid it was a trap. Finally, after what felt like eternity, I cracked the door open and looked outside. The forest was empty. No footprints, no signs of recent presence. Only the remnants of the struggle. A broken window, scattered dirt, and one shoe left near the door, likely dropped in haste. Relief surged, tempered by exhaustion. Whoever it had been, they had fled. I spent the day reinforcing the windows and doors, packing essential items in case I had to escape. I realized that staying longer would be a mistake. The solitude I had wanted had become a liability, almost deadly. I left that evening, taking the main path back to the gravel road. The forest seemed calmer in the fading light, but I kept my eyes open, my senses alert. Every snapping twig made my heart leap, but I didn't turn back. The cabin, which had seemed like a haven, receded into the trees. When I finally reached the first sign of civilization, a small roadside diner with flickering neon, I collapsed in my car and just stared. The danger was over, but the memory of those nights stayed with me. The fear, the constant awareness, and the realization that someone had been watching, waiting, and planning left a mark I couldn't shake. Weeks later, I returned briefly to collect my remaining belongings under daylight and with a friend. The cabin stood silent and empty, its walls still creaking in the wind. Nothing was inside to indicate life, just the broken window and the scattered dirt. I had no proof of who or what had been out there. The experience changed me. I never sought isolation like that again. I understood now that solitude in the wrong place can be dangerous. The forest, with all its beauty and peace, had a dark side I had underestimated. I survived, but only by constant vigilance, quick thinking, and a measure of luck that I didn't fully understand. The cabin remained a silent warning of how fragile safety can be when faced with someone willing to violate it. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, imagining footsteps outside my window, the slow scrape of a branch against a door. The fear is not constant anymore, but it's ingrained. I don't stay in remote cabins alone. I don't leave paths untraveled. I don't assume the forest is ever truly empty. That cabin taught me that danger can hide in plain sight, and that survival sometimes depends on recognizing it before it's too late. The memory is vivid. The smell of wet wood, the cold steel of the axe in my hands, the endless shadowy trees, and I know I will never forget it. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. The stress from work had become unbearable, and I desperately needed a break. A few days away, alone, in the forest, with nothing but silence and the cold air, sounded like the perfect escape. I had rented a small cabin through a private listing. It wasn't fancy, but it was in a secluded area, far from any town or main road. The pictures online had shown a rustic wooden cabin, surrounded by dense trees and a small lake in the distance. I didn't care about luxury. I wanted isolation, and this place promised exactly that. The drive there had taken longer than I expected. The GPS led me down long dirt roads, the kind where the trees leaned so close you had to drive slowly, or risk brushing against a branch. The air grew cooler as I drove deeper into the woods, and the sun began to sink behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. When I finally saw the cabin, it was exactly as the pictures had shown. The wooden exterior was weathered, but sturdy. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, although I didn't notice any neighbors around. The surrounding forest pressed close to the small clearing the cabin sat in, and I immediately felt the weight of isolation settle over me. I parked the car and unloaded my bag, noticing how quiet it was. Not just quiet like the city isn't, but a kind of heavy silence that pressed against your ears. The kind that makes you aware of every small sound, the crunch of gravel under your shoes, the rustle of the wind in the trees. It was calming at first, almost meditative, but as I approached the cabin, I felt a small flicker of unease. My mind tried to rationalize it. It's just being alone. It's just the unfamiliar surroundings. I shook my head and opened the cabin door. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust, mixed with a faint lingering smell of smoke. It had a small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, and a single bedroom upstairs. The furniture was basic, worn, but serviceable. I unpacked my things, set a kettle on the stove, and poured myself a cup of tea. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. The wind whispered through the trees, and I realized there was no sound of animals. No birds calling, not even insects buzzing. It was too quiet, but I tried to ignore it. I told myself I had come here to relax, to escape the chaos of life. I had no reason to be anxious. The first night was uneventful. I ate a simple dinner, lit a small fire in the fireplace, and went to bed early. I slept fitfully, waking occasionally at strange creaks and groans from the cabin settling. Old wood moves in the cold, I reminded myself. But by morning, I felt rested, and the sun streaming through the small cabin window made the world seem calm and peaceful. I spent the first day walking the trails near the cabin. The forest was dense, with thick undergrowth, and fallen leaves crunched under my feet. The lake I had seen from the pictures was farther than I expected. When I reached it, the water was still and dark, reflecting the sky like a mirror. I sat on the shore for a long time, listening to the faint sound of water lapping against rocks. It was beautiful. It was quiet in the way that makes your own thoughts feel loud. I returned to the cabin in the evening, tired but calm. It was the second night when things started to feel off. I had eaten, made another small fire, and sat staring into the flames. Outside, the wind had picked up, and it rattled the windows. The sound was normal, I told myself, just the trees, just the weather. But then I heard something else. A snap, very faint, like a branch breaking under weight. I froze, trying to listen. There it was again, closer this time. I got up and peered out the window, scanning the dark treeline. There was nothing. No movement, no shadow, nothing. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe a deer, maybe just the wind. Sleep that night was worse than the first. Every small sound made me jump. The creak of the cabin, the wind against the roof, the rustle of leaves. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps on the deck outside the door. I sat up, heart racing, and listened. Silence. I told myself it was my imagination. After a while, I fell into an uneasy sleep. By the next day, I was already tense. I tried to distract myself, doing small chores around the cabin. I cleaned, stacked firewood, checked the supplies I had brought. But there was a constant undercurrent of unease I couldn't shake. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the trees made me start. I noticed something as I looked out the window. Footprints in the mud near the cabin. They were faint, not clear, but they were there. I stepped outside to examine them, but they didn't lead anywhere, disappearing into the thick forest. My stomach tightened. Someone had been here. The thought made my chest ache. I spent the day pacing, looking out the windows and listening. The forest no longer felt peaceful. Felt like it was watching me. Shadows seemed deeper, noises sharper. I didn't want to go outside. I tried to call the number I had been given for the cabin owner, but there was no signal. I realized I was completely cut off. The isolation that had seemed so peaceful before now felt suffocating. That night was unbearable. The wind was worse, rattling the cabin. I kept the fire going, but I didn't feel any warmth from it. I sat in the corner of the room, listening, heart pounding. At some point, I heard the door creak. My stomach sank. I grabbed a kitchen knife and went to check, carefully opening the door a little. Nothing. I peered into the darkness outside, just trees and shadows. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, trying to control my breathing. The rest of the night passed slowly, each minute stretching like hours. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay inside anymore. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed my boots and a flashlight and decided to check the area around the cabin. The footprints had returned, this time clearer, leading into the woods. They weren't deep, but they were there. Someone had been moving around the cabin, close, very close, in the night. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, but I had to be rational. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone camping illegally. I followed the tracks cautiously, moving slowly through the trees. I had always liked being alone in the woods. There was something about the quiet, the smell of pine, the way the wind moved through the trees, that made me feel alive in a way that city life never could. I had rented a small cabin far away from the nearest town, in a forested area I had never been to before. The place was basic, almost bare. A small kitchen, a wood stove, a bed, and a tiny bathroom. The electricity was unreliable, but that didn't matter to me. I wanted isolation, and this cabin promised exactly that. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the hills. The road was gravel, and my car kicked up clouds of dust as I drove the last few miles. When I finally reached the cabin, I noticed how silent it was, how nothing moved except the trees swaying gently. I parked, unloaded my bags, and took a long look at the cabin. It was a simple wooden structure, weathered by years of wind and snow, but still solid. There were no other houses in sight. The closest sign of human presence was a dirt road leading back the way I came, winding through the trees. Inside, I unpacked slowly, laying out my supplies. Canned food, a few bottles of water, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. I had brought a small portable generator, but I was hesitant to use it yet. I liked the darkness, the way the forest seemed to press in around the cabin, reminding me that I was completely alone. I started a fire in the stove, filling the room with the smell of burning wood. The warmth felt good against the chill that was already creeping in from the windows. The first night was uneventful, though I couldn't shake a slight sense of unease. Every small noise, the creak of a floorboard, the rustle of leaves outside, the distant call of a bird, felt amplified. I had chosen isolation, but even so, the silence was different from anything I had known. It wasn't peaceful. It was alive, and it made me aware of how exposed I was. I went to bed earlier than usual, telling myself that I would adjust in time. The next morning, I woke to sunlight slanting through the thin curtains. The forest outside looked calm and inviting, but there was a stillness, a weight to the air that made me uneasy. I had brought books to read, so I spent the morning sitting near the window, sipping coffee and watching the forest. Birds flitted between the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear water running. It was a small stream, I guessed, though I hadn't explored that far yet. By the afternoon, I decided to walk. I wanted to stretch my legs, see the area around the cabin. The forest was dense but not impossible to navigate. I followed animal trails, listening to the crunch of leaves and twigs under my boots. As I walked, I noticed something that made me pause. There were no signs of other humans, not even footprints or trash. It was as if the area had been untouched for years. First, it was exhilarating. Then, slowly, the thought settled in. If something went wrong, there was no one around to help me. The nearest town was miles away. My phone had little to no signal. I felt a flicker of anxiety but pushed it aside, telling myself I was being paranoid. I returned to the cabin around sunset. The forest had changed. Shadows stretched long, and the air was colder. I built a fire in the stove again, and for the first time, I noticed the silence in a deeper way. It wasn't just quiet. It was oppressive. The wind had stopped, and the usual sounds of the forest were muted. I tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows, to the darkness just beyond them. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every sound startled me. A branch snapping in the yard made me sit up straight. The wind moaned through the cracks in the cabin walls. I kept imagining shapes moving outside, always just out of clear sight. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just the forest, that it was safe. But my stomach tightened, and I found myself listening for things that weren't there. The following days settled into a routine. I explored more of the forest during the day, returning before dark. I chopped wood for the stove, boiled water, and cooked simple meals. I noticed animals more closely now. Squirrels darting between trees, deer grazing in the distance, and once, a fox that watched me silently before slipping into the shadows. At first, this observation calmed me, made me feel part of the wilderness. But it also made me hyper-aware of the unpredictability of the environment. I remembered reading about accidents in cabins, people injured and trapped in the woods. The thought lingered, gnawing at me. On the fourth night, something changed. I was in bed when I heard it. The sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. I froze. The forest was quiet again, so these weren't animal sounds. My heart pounded as I listened. The steps circled the cabin. I considered calling someone, but my phone barely worked. I stayed perfectly still, trying to make out any other noises. The steps stopped on the far side of the cabin. I strained my ears. Nothing. Then, a window rattled slightly, as if something had leaned against it. I held my breath, willing it to be the wind, though I knew it wasn't. I stayed like that until the noise faded into silence. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked the perimeter. There were marks in the dirt, footprints around the cabin. They weren't deep or large, but they were there. Someone had been close enough to touch the walls. I felt my stomach twist. I was not alone. That day, I considered leaving, but I told myself it could have been hunters or hikers. Still, I reinforced the doors and windows, checking locks and placing heavy objects against weak points. I realized I had underestimated how exposed I was. Over the next 2 days, the unease grew. I stayed mostly inside, only venturing out during the day. At night, I slept in clothes, knife nearby, flashlight on the bed. The forest seemed alive in a new way. Shadows moved differently. Sounds echoed unnaturally. I kept seeing movement at the edge of my vision. I didn't know if I was imagining it or if someone was watching me. It was terrifying. Every small noise made me tense. Every rustle a potential threat. On the 7th day, the situation escalated. I was making coffee in the kitchen when I noticed the door handle moving slightly. Someone was trying it. Panic surged, but I stayed calm enough to grab my flashlight and knife. I couldn't see anyone outside, but the footprints around the cabin had returned. Larger now, deeper, fresher. Someone had come back. I realized they could be watching me from the forest. Hiding. My options were limited. I couldn't call for help. I couldn't run without exposing myself. I decided to wait, watch, and plan. That night, I kept every light on. I stayed awake, listening. Hours passed. At around 3 in the morning, I heard a sound I will never forget. A slow scraping along the side of the cabin. Something heavy, dragging. I held my breath. I thought about barricading myself in a room, but the thought of being trapped scared me more. The noise stopped suddenly. I didn't dare move for what felt like hours. When the sun finally began to rise, I peeked outside. There were fresh marks along the walls, scratches deep in the wood, as if someone or something had tried to force its way in. My blood ran cold. I couldn't stay. I decided to leave immediately. I packed quickly, throwing everything into my bags. The forest looked calm in the early morning light, but I knew better now. I had been watched, stalked, and possibly followed. As I drove away, I glanced back. The cabin sat quietly among the trees, like nothing had happened. But the marks were still there in my mind. I didn't stop until I reached a town far away, where I could see other people and feel the sense of safety I had taken for granted. Later, I reported what had happened. Rangers checked the area but found nothing unusual. No one was caught, no explanation was given. But I knew the truth. Someone had been there, close enough to threaten me, yet elusive enough to vanish into the forest. The experience stayed with me. I never returned to that cabin, never sought isolation in the woods again. I realized the forest is not just quiet or beautiful. It can hide dangers, both seen and unseen. The memory of those nights, the sounds, the shadows, the fear, would remain with me forever. In time, I moved on. I told myself I had survived, that I had acted carefully and stayed alive. I kept all my survival gear, sharpened my awareness, and learned to trust my instincts. It changed how I viewed the world, not with paranoia, but with a sober respect for the unseen risks that can lurk in quiet places. I never felt powerless again. I had faced real fear, and I had come through it alive. That was the most important part. I had survived, and I had survived alone, relying only on myself, my mind, and my ability to act when every instinct told me something was wrong. And for that, I knew I could handle whatever life threw at me next. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea of spending a week alone in a remote cabin, away from the constant noise and clutter of the city, had been obsessively appealing to me. I imagined waking up to the crisp smell of pine, the gentle sound of wind in the trees, and the quiet, steady rhythm of my own thoughts without the constant hum of traffic, phones, or people. The cabin was advertised as rustic but sturdy, nestled deep in a forested valley, accessible only by a long dirt road. When I finally packed my car with supplies, food, water, batteries, a first aid kit, and firewood, I felt a mix of anticipation and nervous excitement, the kind that comes with stepping into a place that promises total isolation. The drive to the cabin was longer than I had expected. The dirt road twisted through dense woods, with trees so thick on either side that the sunlight barely reached the ground. By the time I arrived, the sun was beginning to sink behind the hills, casting the forest in long shadows. The cabin itself looked exactly like the photos: weathered wood, a small porch, and windows that reflected the deep green of the forest. The surrounding area was silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. It was serene, almost too perfect. I parked the car, grabbed my supplies, and pushed open the creaking door, stepping inside. The interior was modest but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and there was a small kitchen area with basic utensils, a wood stove, and a table. 2 bedrooms sat off the main room along with a bathroom. Everything was clean, though it carried a faint musty smell of wood and damp, the kind that reminded me of old cabins in the mountains. I unpacked my supplies, stacked firewood neatly by the fireplace, and made myself a simple dinner. By the time I was done, darkness had fully settled over the forest, and the cabin felt like a pocket of stillness in the middle of the world. That first night, I went to bed early. I slept fitfully, partially from excitement, partially from the unfamiliar sounds of the forest. Every creak of the cabin floor, every tap of branches against the window, made me tense, but I reminded myself that I was alone here by choice, that there was nothing to fear. The night was cold, and I woke occasionally, noticing the sharp contrast between the warmth of my sleeping bag and the chill seeping through the cabin walls. By morning, I felt more awake and determined to explore the area. I spent the first few days wandering the forest around the cabin, mapping out paths, identifying landmarks, and collecting kindling for the fire. The forest was beautiful, almost hypnotic in its quiet intensity. Birds moved through the trees, squirrels scurried across the ground, and the wind carried a smell of damp earth and pine needles. I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't known in years. I was aware of the solitude, but I had always assumed that was part of the allure. I had read about safety precautions, keeping a charged phone, notifying a friend of my location, but I also knew cell service was weak, and that was part of the plan. I wanted isolation. I wanted to see if I could handle it. It was on the 4th night that the unease began. I had gone to bed earlier than usual because I had spent the day hiking farther into the forest than planned. I had stacked the firewood, cooked a small dinner, and finally sat in the darkness with the fire crackling in the hearth. The wind outside had picked up, and the trees groaned in response, scraping their branches together in a sound that made me tense. I remember thinking that this was part of living in the woods, that the noise was nothing unusual, until I heard something that wasn't the wind. A faint, deliberate scraping sound came from outside. Not tapping, not the wind rattling the windows, scraping, like someone dragging something across the ground near the cabin. I froze, listening. My heart rate increased, but I told myself it was probably an animal. Bears, deer, raccoons, they could make all sorts of sounds. But this didn't sound like a normal animal. It was steady, moving slowly around the cabin, circling me. I remembered the advice I had read about staying calm, not panicking, and making sure all doors were locked. I quietly checked the locks on each door and window, making sure nothing was left open. The sound continued, occasionally stopping and then starting again, almost as if the person or animal outside was testing me, watching me. Sleep became impossible. I sat in the living room, staring into the fire, listening. Hours passed, and the scratching continued intermittently. I considered calling for help, but the signal was non-existent. I had no one to reach. I decided to wait until morning, hoping daylight would resolve everything. I felt trapped in the cabin, every sound amplified, every shadow a potential threat. Morning arrived slowly. I stepped outside, careful to scan the perimeter. The forest looked the same as it had always been. No footprints, no signs of animals larger than deer, nothing. I began to rationalize. Maybe it had been a branch brushing against the siding. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. The relief was temporary, though. That night, the scraping returned, louder and more deliberate. It wasn't continuous but intermittent, moving around the cabin in a way that suggested awareness, intent. I began to notice other things the following day. Small signs that something or someone had been there. A piece of firewood I had stacked differently was now knocked over. A small scratch appeared on the doorframe that hadn't been there before. My heart sank as I realized it wasn't an animal. Whoever or whatever had been circling the cabin was leaving traces. Fear took root in me in a way I hadn't experienced before. I began to plan escape routes, memorizing the paths I had mapped during my hikes, thinking of the car at the end of the dirt road, and the long drive back to civilization. By the 6th night, the fear had become oppressive. I barely slept, and the scratching outside the cabin was relentless. I kept a knife on the table next to me, along with a heavy flashlight. Every creak of the cabin floor made me tense, every rustle in the wind a potential threat. I refused to leave the cabin at night, locking every door and window, but I knew the intruder could be patient. I thought about climbing into the attic or some hidden space, but the cabin was small, and the attic was accessible only by a narrow ladder that led to a cramped crawl space. That option would be almost as dangerous as staying in the main room. That night, the sound changed. I realized that it wasn't random scratching anymore. It was focused, coming from the back of the cabin near the kitchen window. I felt my stomach knot. My fear was now acute, raw, physical. The possibility that someone had been following me for days, waiting for me to arrive, hit me with crushing clarity. I wanted to call the police, but the lack of service made that impossible. I considered running to the car and driving away, but that would require leaving the cabin unguarded, exposing myself. Hours passed in tense silence, punctuated by occasional scraping. At one point, the door handle rattled. I froze, gripping the knife. My breath was loud in the quiet room. Then, slowly, I heard footsteps moving away from the cabin. The sound eventually faded, leaving only the wind. I waited until dawn, every nerve on edge, before I dared to look outside. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. But the feeling of being watched lingered. By that morning, I realized I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly but methodically, keeping all supplies together, leaving nothing behind that could slow me down. My plan was simple: drive to the nearest town, report what had happened, and never return to that cabin. The forest seemed calm as I walked to my car, but every shadow, every movement in the corner of my eye made me tense. I kept my knife and flashlight within reach. I left the cabin, driving cautiously along the dirt road. The sunlight was harsh, washing the forest in gold, but it brought some relief. Every now and then, I thought I saw a figure among the trees, but it was always fleeting. A shadow, a tree trunk, a trick of the light. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I drove, and I felt the adrenaline that had built up over the past days finally beginning to subside. When I finally reached a town, I pulled over and contacted the local sheriff. I explained as best I could, my voice shaking as I recounted the scraping, the scratches, and the general sense of being watched. The sheriff listened, then promised to check the cabin and the surrounding area. I didn't wait for confirmation. I rented a motel room and collapsed on the bed, exhausted in a way I hadn't known. My sleep that night was deep, uninterrupted, and mercifully uneventful. The following days were filled with calls and reports. The sheriff confirmed that there had been signs someone had trespassed in the area, though they had not caught anyone. Tracks led in and out of the forest near the cabin, evidence that someone had been watching, possibly living in the woods for some time. They suggested I never return, and I agreed. Took weeks before I felt entirely safe again. The forest, once a place of calm and beauty, now felt foreign, almost threatening. But I learned something about myself in that cabin, about how quickly fear can transform from a mental state into a physical reality, and how important preparation and awareness are when in isolation. I returned to my routine life in the city, appreciating its noise and chaos, its predictability. The cabin was behind me, a reminder of vulnerability and the strange, quiet terror that can exist in solitude. Even now, years later, I remember that cabin in vivid detail, the feel of the cold wooden floors beneath my feet, the smell of firewood mixed with damp pine, the relentless scratching at night that made every second stretch endlessly. I never returned, and I never will. The forest is still there, the cabin standing somewhere hidden among the trees, but it exists now only in memory, a place where fear became real, and survival required every ounce of attention, courage, and patience I had. I survived, and I am clear about what it taught me. That danger doesn't have to be supernatural to be terrifying, that isolation can magnify fear in ways nothing else can, and that sometimes the safest place is not in solitude, but in returning to the world where others can see and help you. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea of spending a week alone in a remote cabin, away from the constant noise and clutter of the city, had been obsessively appealing to me. I imagined waking up to the crisp smell of pine, the gentle sound of wind in the trees, and the quiet, steady rhythm of my own thoughts without the constant hum of traffic, phones, or people. The cabin was advertised as rustic but sturdy, nestled deep in a forested valley, accessible only by a long dirt road. When I finally packed my car with supplies, food, water, batteries, a first aid kit, and firewood, I felt a mix of anticipation and nervous excitement, the kind that comes with stepping into a place that promises total isolation. The drive to the cabin was longer than I had expected. The dirt road twisted through dense woods, with trees so thick on either side that the sunlight barely reached the ground. By the time I arrived, the sun was beginning to sink behind the hills, casting the forest in long shadows. The cabin itself looked exactly like the photos: weathered wood, a small porch, and windows that reflected the deep green of the forest. The surrounding area was silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. It was serene, almost too perfect. I parked the car, grabbed my supplies, and pushed open the creaking door, stepping inside. The interior was modest but comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and there was a small kitchen area with basic utensils, a wood stove, and a table. 2 bedrooms sat off the main room along with a bathroom. Everything was clean, though it carried a faint musty smell of wood and damp, the kind that reminded me of old cabins in the mountains. I unpacked my supplies, stacked firewood neatly by the fireplace, and made myself a simple dinner. By the time I was done, darkness had fully settled over the forest, and the cabin felt like a pocket of stillness in the middle of the world. That first night, I went to bed early. I slept fitfully, partially from excitement, partially from the unfamiliar sounds of the forest. Every creak of the cabin floor, every tap of branches against the window, made me tense, but I reminded myself that I was alone here by choice, that there was nothing to fear. The night was cold, and I woke occasionally, noticing the sharp contrast between the warmth of my sleeping bag and the chill seeping through the cabin walls. By morning, I felt more awake and determined to explore the area. I spent the first few days wandering the forest around the cabin, mapping out paths, identifying landmarks, and collecting kindling for the fire. The forest was beautiful, almost hypnotic in its quiet intensity. Birds moved through the trees, squirrels scurried across the ground, and the wind carried a smell of damp earth and pine needles. I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't known in years. I was aware of the solitude, but I had always assumed that was part of the allure. I had read about safety precautions, keeping a charged phone, notifying a friend of my location, but I also knew cell service was weak, and that was part of the plan. I wanted isolation. I wanted to see if I could handle it. It was on the 4th night that the unease began. I had gone to bed earlier than usual because I had spent the day hiking farther into the forest than planned. I had stacked the firewood, cooked a small dinner, and finally sat in the darkness with the fire crackling in the hearth. The wind outside had picked up, and the trees groaned in response, scraping their branches together in a sound that made me tense. I remember thinking that this was part of living in the woods, that the noise was nothing unusual, until I heard something that wasn't the wind. A faint, deliberate scraping sound came from outside. Not tapping, not the wind rattling the windows, scraping, like someone dragging something across the ground near the cabin. I froze, listening. My heart rate increased, but I told myself it was probably an animal. Bears, deer, raccoons, they could make all sorts of sounds. But this didn't sound like a normal animal. It was steady, moving slowly around the cabin, circling me. I remembered the advice I had read about staying calm, not panicking, and making sure all doors were locked. I quietly checked the locks on each door and window, making sure nothing was left open. The sound continued, occasionally stopping and then starting again, almost as if the person or animal outside was testing me, watching me. Sleep became impossible. I sat in the living room, staring into the fire, listening. Hours passed, and the scratching continued intermittently. I considered calling for help, but the signal was non-existent. I had no one to reach. I decided to wait until morning, hoping daylight would resolve everything. I felt trapped in the cabin, every sound amplified, every shadow a potential threat. Morning arrived slowly. I stepped outside, careful to scan the perimeter. The forest looked the same as it had always been. No footprints, no signs of animals larger than deer, nothing. I began to rationalize. Maybe it had been a branch brushing against the siding. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. The relief was temporary, though. That night, the scraping returned, louder and more deliberate. It wasn't continuous but intermittent, moving around the cabin in a way that suggested awareness, intent. I had been driving for hours on a narrow, twisting road, the kind that disappears into dense forest before you even notice it started. The trees pressed close to the edge of the asphalt, their trunks rough and dark, their branches swaying silently in the wind, casting uneven shadows that flickered across the windshield as my headlights passed over them. I had been looking forward to this cabin trip for weeks. The idea of being completely alone in the wilderness, away from phones, away from people, away from all the noise of everyday life had seemed exhilarating. The reality, however, was different from the fantasy I had imagined. I arrived just before sunset. The cabin was a small, weathered structure tucked into a hollow between two hills. Its wooden exterior was gray and cracked, and the roof sagged slightly on one side. I could smell the damp wood, the forest floor, the faintly bitter scent of moss and decaying leaves. I parked my car on a patch of flattened grass near the cabin, stepped out, and immediately felt the weight of the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence you get in the city when everyone has gone to sleep. It was the kind of silence that presses on your ears, that makes your own heartbeat sound loud, makes you aware of every twitch of a branch, every scuttling insect, every distant bird call fading into the dusk. I unloaded my backpack, which carried a modest amount of food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, a heavy-duty knife, and a small folding saw. I had also brought a few books and my laptop, but I didn't intend to use them much. The first thing I did was inspect the cabin. The door creaked on its hinges, the latch old but sturdy. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of mold and wood smoke, a smell that suggested it had been used occasionally but not maintained regularly. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I noticed gaps between some of them, which made me step carefully. I set down my gear, opened the windows for ventilation, and began to explore. The cabin had a small living area with a stone fireplace, a kitchen corner with an old sink and a wood-burning stove, a tiny bathroom with a rusted but functional toilet, and a loft with a mattress covered in a rough blanket. The loft was reached by a narrow wooden ladder that seemed almost dangerous to climb. The cabin had no electricity, which I had expected, but there was a small propane lantern and a stack of firewood near the fireplace. The setting sun cast long shadows inside the cabin, and the air began to grow colder as night approached. I built a fire in the fireplace, using the dry kindling I had brought along, and sat near it as the light from the flames made the room glow with an uneven warmth. Outside, the wind had picked up. The trees swayed more aggressively, and the sound of branches scraping together was sharp and sudden at times. I tried to convince myself it was nothing to worry about, just the forest being alive. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I knew it was irrational. The first night passed uneventfully, with only the forest sounds and the occasional hoot of an owl to keep me company. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I walked along a narrow path that led up the hill behind the cabin, my boots crunching over dry leaves, twigs snapping underfoot. The forest here was thick, almost impenetrable, and every few minutes I would hear something moving, branches breaking, leaves rustling. But whenever I turned toward the sound, there was nothing. I found an old well hidden behind a thicket of trees. Its stones were covered in moss, the wooden cover splintered and broken. I didn't linger long. There was something about it that felt wrong, a weight in the air that made me uneasy. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. I would wake with the sun, fetch water from a nearby creek, chop some wood for the fireplace, and explore small sections of the forest. I kept my knife strapped to my belt and made sure the flashlight always had fresh batteries. The isolation was starting to get to me. At first, it had been exciting, but now the silence pressed in more heavily. I would hear sounds in the forest that made me stop mid-step. Twigs snapping in patterns that seemed too deliberate, soft thuds that I could not explain, the crunch of leaves that suggested someone, or something, was walking slowly nearby. Each time, I would freeze, scanning the shadows, but never saw anything. One evening, about a week into my stay, I was gathering firewood when I noticed footprints in the soft mud near the edge of the clearing. They were human footprints, large, deep, and recent. My heart started pounding. The nearest house or road was miles away. I had expected the forest to be completely empty, yet here was proof that someone had been near my cabin. I followed the prints cautiously, keeping low behind the underbrush. They led to the edge of the forest, where the ground was covered in thick pine needles. There were no more tracks beyond that, as if whoever had made them had disappeared into the trees. I returned to the cabin, my hands shaking slightly as I stacked the firewood. That night, I locked the door, secured the windows as best I could, and kept the lantern near the bed. I stayed awake for hours listening. The wind was strong, rattling the cabin, and at times it sounded like footsteps circling the cabin outside. My imagination started working against me, but I had to remind myself it was probably just animals. Still, sleep was difficult. The following morning, I discovered something that made my stomach turn. My food supplies had been disturbed. Cans that I had neatly stacked were scattered, some opened. My backpack was partially unzipped. Whoever, or whatever, had been in the cabin was no longer there, but the signs were unmistakable. I realized then that I was not just in an isolated forest. I was in the path of someone who could have been living in the woods, someone who had found my cabin before and was now checking if I had returned. I spent the next day fortifying the cabin as best I could. I stacked heavy logs against the door, nailed boards over the lower half of the windows, and made sure my knife and a makeshift club were within reach at all times. I prepared mentally to wait out the night, knowing that the forest outside could harbor someone watching, waiting, or trying to test me. That night, the sounds were louder. Branches cracked as if someone was moving just outside the clearing. I held my breath, gripping the knife, staring at the darkened windows. Hours passed with no sign. Then at some point, exhaustion forced me into a shallow sleep. I woke to silence. The morning light streaming through the windows was reassuring. I ventured outside cautiously, scanning the clearing. No footprints, no signs of disturbance, at least none that I could see at first. I inspected the area thoroughly and found that a few logs I had stacked near the cabin had been moved slightly, as if someone had tested the barriers. Confirmed what I feared. Someone had been there recently and could return. I spent the next day packing essentials into my car. I didn't want to leave completely, but I couldn't stay and risk an encounter. As I moved my backpack and supplies, I noticed something odd. Small, broken branches around the car, bent in the same way they were the previous night, suggesting that someone had circled the car while I was inside. My pulse quickened. I locked the cabin one last time, making it appear undisturbed, and left the area slowly, keeping my eyes on the treeline as I drove down the narrow road. The drive back to civilization was tense. Every shadow along the road, every sudden animal movement made me flinch. I kept thinking about the cabin, about the footsteps, about the footprints in the mud, about how close someone had been without me knowing. I realized that the forest had seemed peaceful, but it hid dangers that I could not anticipate. When I returned home, I reported the incident to the local ranger station, describing the footprints and the disturbances in the cabin. They advised me to stay away from that area for a while, as there had been reports of individuals living in the forest illegally. I realized then that my adventure had been naive. The wilderness could be beautiful, but it could also harbor threats beyond animals. Threats that were human, patient, and hard to predict. The cabin trip had been meant as an escape, a way to experience solitude and peace. Instead, it became a lesson in vigilance, preparation, and respect for the unknown. I never returned to that cabin. I made sure to research future locations more carefully to avoid isolation that put me at risk. It haunted me for weeks, the thought that someone could have been watching, learning my habits, knowing I was alone, but it also taught me something valuable. Nature is unforgiving, and humans who hide within it can be even more dangerous. I don't remember the exact reason I decided to rent that cabin deep in the forest, only that I was looking for a place far enough away from everything to think, to get lost in silence, and to escape the constant hum of the city. The idea seemed perfect at the time. A small wooden cabin, a dirt road winding through tall pines, a river not far from the property. It promised solitude and quiet, and I wanted nothing more than to be alone with my thoughts, away from the constant demands of work, phones, and obligations. What I didn't realize then was how quickly the quiet could turn suffocating, how isolation could twist into unease in ways I hadn't imagined. The cabin itself was modest but solid. Its walls were thick logs, weathered by years of rain and snow, and the roof sloped steeply to let winter snows slide off. A small porch ran along the front, enough space for a couple of chairs, and a single light bulb hung near the door. Inside, it smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. The floorboards creaked when I walked across them, uneven in places but sturdy. There was a fireplace in the main room, surrounded by a simple stone mantel, and a small kitchen area that had just enough counter space for preparing meals. Upstairs were two small bedrooms, one larger than the other, both containing old beds with scratchy blankets. The first day passed slowly. I unpacked my things, brought in groceries, and walked down the dirt trail to the river, watching the water curl over rocks, catching sunlight in ways I hadn't noticed before. At night, the sounds of the forest filled the cabin. I had underestimated how loud nature could be. Crickets, frogs, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of wind in the treetops. It all felt unfamiliar and sharp at first. I was sure I would sleep fine, but when I laid in the bed, the silence seemed louder than any city noise. My thoughts turned inward, circling anxieties and memories I had ignored for months. On the second day, I decided to explore the surrounding area more thoroughly. I had a map from the cabin's owner, but it was old and vague. The forest was dense, with underbrush thick in some areas, fallen trees crisscrossing the paths. Birds darted between the branches, and small animals skittered across the forest floor. I walked for hours, following a faint trail that ran parallel to the river, noticing the patterns in the trees, the way the moss clung to rocks, and the occasional distant sight of a deer. It was beautiful, almost hypnotic, but there was a constant edge of alertness in me, a feeling that I was being watched even though I saw no one. That night, I prepared a small dinner and sat in front of the fireplace. I had brought a stack of books, but I didn't read. I kept hearing noises outside, the snapping of branches, the shuffle of leaves. I told myself it was animals, the usual forest life, but I couldn't shake a gnawing unease. When I finally went to bed, I left the window slightly open, but that only let in more of the sounds, and the wind carried strange, hollow groans through the trees. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the cabin, every movement outside, made me tense. I kept imagining someone moving quietly among the trees, watching me, even though I knew it was improbable. The next morning, I woke early. The sky was pale and misty, the kind of gray that pressed down on everything. I went outside to collect water from the river for coffee and noticed that the area around the cabin seemed off. I couldn't explain it clearly. There were footprints in the dirt, not animal tracks, too large and spaced unevenly. They led into the woods and stopped suddenly, as though whoever or whatever had been walking there had vanished. My stomach knotted. I told myself it was probably someone passing through, maybe hunters, or the previous tenants who had left early. Still, I felt watched. I decided to stay inside for the rest of the day. I moved chairs closer to the windows, just to see more of the surrounding forest, and I kept my phone nearby, though I had little signal. The sun dipped low, and the shadows stretched across the forest floor. I tried to ignore the sounds. A branch snapping, a low rustle in the underbrush, the echo of something falling far off. But as the evening grew darker, the noises became sharper, closer. The air around the cabin felt heavier, colder than the temperature suggested, and every small sound made me jump. I checked the locks on the doors repeatedly, walked from window to window, and tried to rationalize each noise. That night, around midnight, I heard it. The sound of footsteps approaching the cabin. They were deliberate, slow, and unmistakable. Not the scatter of an animal, but the weight and cadence of someone walking in boots. My heart slammed in my chest. I froze, listening, trying to convince myself it was a tree branch or the wind. But then there was a pause and a low scrape against the porch. Someone or something was out there. I didn't panic at first, though panic hovered at the edge of my mind. I checked my phone. Still almost no signal. I grabbed the baseball bat I had leaning against the wall, a useless but comforting weight in my hands. I moved toward the door, careful not to make a sound, and peered through the window. The porch was empty. No one. My pulse hammered, my stomach twisted, and I debated whether to go outside or stay put. Hours passed. The noises didn't stop. Footsteps circled the cabin, sometimes near the windows, sometimes in the distance, always returning. I stayed crouched near the fireplace, the bat in hand, listening to the rhythm of the night. Every time a branch snapped, my muscles tensed, ready to strike, but nothing appeared. The night was endless, and sleep was impossible. By dawn, my arms ached, my legs stiffened, and I was drained. In the morning, I inspected the cabin carefully. The door was scratched, the porch floorboard scuffed. Footprints in the dirt circled the house, some fresh, some older. They weren't animal tracks, that much was clear. Someone had been here. I felt a cold panic. My first instinct was to leave, to get into my car and drive miles away. But the road was long and unpaved, and I didn't know if whoever had been circling the cabin was still nearby. I decided to wait, to watch, to gather evidence before moving. I spent the next day barricading the cabin as best I could. I moved furniture against the doors, nailed a few loose boards over the windows, and kept my phone charged as much as possible, even with minimal signal. I also tried to map the footsteps around the property. They never went too far into the woods but stayed close enough to intimidate. Each day, the sense of being watched intensified. I rarely left the cabin, only briefly to check the water or gather firewood. And even then, I moved quickly, scanning constantly. By the third day, I realized that the person outside was methodical. They were testing my boundaries, staying just out of reach, making me anxious and paranoid. I found makeshift traps around the property. Branches bent at odd angles, rocks piled unnaturally, signs that someone had been circling the cabin for hours. It became clear they knew I was there, watching, aware of them. My heart sank with the understanding that this wasn't random. Someone had singled me out. The nights were the worst. I couldn't sleep for more than an hour at a time. The sounds of footsteps, scraping, the occasional thud outside, kept me alert. I barely ate, barely moved. I rationed water and food, knowing I couldn't leave the cabin without being vulnerable. I kept the fire going in the fireplace for light and warmth, but the shadows it cast only reminded me of how exposed I was. Every creak of the cabin felt deliberate, as if the house itself were being tested by someone's presence. On the fourth day, I decided to act. Staying inside, hiding, was no longer safe. I needed to get help. I couldn't stay trapped, waiting for whoever it was to decide to make their presence known more aggressively. I planned a path to the car. The dirt road was visible from the cabin, winding out through the trees for about half a mile before it connected to the main road. I studied the forest from the windows, looking for patterns in the footsteps, trying to predict when it was safe. I packed essentials into a small bag: water, a flashlight, my phone, and the bat. The evening was approaching, and I knew the cover of darkness could either protect me or make me more vulnerable. I decided to wait until nightfall. Then, as the sun dipped below the trees, I slipped out the back door. The forest was darker than I expected. Every step was careful, deliberate. My ears strained for the slightest sound. I moved slowly, keeping to shadows, using every tree as cover. Then I heard it. A branch snapping behind me, sharp and deliberate. I froze, heart racing, listening. The footsteps were following me, closer than before. My pace quickened. I didn't dare run fully. I knew it would make noise, draw attention. The road wasn't far, but every second felt like an eternity. Another snap, then silence, then movement again. I was almost to the car when I saw the shadow of someone moving between the trees, just at the edge of the light from my flashlight. I got into the car as quietly as possible, locking the doors immediately. My hands shook as I started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the dirt road. I drove slowly at first, careful not to attract attention, but soon I accelerated, leaving the forest behind. The footsteps, the shadow, the cabin, it all disappeared behind me. By the time I reached the main road, I could see distant lights, signs of civilization. I called the police immediately, explaining everything. They asked questions, took details, and then sent a patrol to the cabin. When they returned a few hours later, they confirmed that someone had been camping near the property, observing the cabin, leaving signs and footprints, but they hadn't stayed long. They didn't find the person and no one was charged, but I was advised not to return. In the days and weeks afterward, I kept thinking about the cabin, about how quickly isolation had turned into fear. I realized that nature wasn't the frightening part. The fear came from another human, from the unpredictability of someone deliberately invading your space. I never went back to that forest, but I kept the lessons with me. Always trust your instincts, always prepare for the unexpected, and never underestimate how vulnerable you can be when no one is around to see or hear what happens. The drive back was tense. Every bend, every shadow in the tree line made me flinch. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But the forest remained empty. The road gradually widened, the trees thinning as I returned to the outskirts of civilization. When I finally reached the first gas station, I pulled over, my hands still shaking. I sat in the car for a long time, trying to convince myself that I was safe, that whatever had been outside the cabin had not followed me. Over the next few days, I processed what had happened. The logical part of me kept telling myself it had probably been a squatter or a trespasser, someone living off the grid who didn't want to be discovered. Maybe they had been observing the cabin for days, and my presence triggered them to move closer. The thought was terrifying, but it made sense. The forest, no matter how serene, could hide people as easily as it could hide animals. Eventually, I went back to my routine, but I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that stayed with me. I realized that the true danger in the wilderness wasn't wildlife, storms, or the cold. It was other people. Someone with intent, patience, and knowledge of the area could make even the safest cabin a trap. That understanding changed the way I approached the outdoors forever. Months later, I returned to the cabin with law enforcement and proof of trespassing. The footprints had led to an abandoned camp a few miles away. Inside, we found evidence that someone had been living there for weeks, possibly months, moving silently, observing the surrounding area. The authorities never found the person, but the discovery confirmed what I had feared. I had survived, but it could have been different if I had been careless. After that experience, I learned to respect the solitude of the wilderness not just for its beauty, but for the danger it could conceal. I returned to cabins and forests many times after, but I never again went unprepared, never again assumed I was alone in a place that felt completely empty. Survival, I learned, was as much about awareness and caution as it was about firewood, food, and water. That summer, in that isolated cabin, I learned that lesson in the most vivid way possible, and I carried it with me every time I stepped into the quiet of the woods again. I had been planning this cabin trip for months. It wasn't some extravagant getaway. It was the sort of place where I could disappear for a few days, somewhere deep in the woods, far from the distractions of the city. The cabin itself was small and rustic, built from aged pine logs that had darkened over time, but it was sturdy. The owner, a man I had spoken to over email, assured me that the place was completely isolated, with only the forest around it and a small dirt road leading in. That was exactly what I wanted. I had spent too long surrounded by noise, by people, by the constant demands of life, and I needed silence, the kind you could feel pressing against your skin when you were alone in the woods. The drive there was long, winding through narrow roads that became narrower and dustier as I went further. By the time I reached the last bend, the cabin came into view, tucked between tall pines, the roof barely visible from the road. It had no electricity except for a single solar panel, no internet, and no immediate neighbors. The isolation was perfect. I parked my car and stepped out, the smell of pine needles and damp earth hitting me instantly. I took a deep breath, savoring it. The air felt alive, but in a way that reminded me I was incredibly small and completely alone. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and something older, a faint mustiness, the kind that comes from long winters of unused rooms. The furniture was minimal. A small table, 2 chairs, a bed with a thin mattress, and a wood stove in the corner. There were shelves lined with canned food, jars, and some old cooking utensils. A stack of firewood sat neatly in the corner, and a small bucket held water from a nearby stream. Everything was exactly as promised. I unpacked a few essentials, set my backpack down on the bed, and started a fire in the stove. The sound of the wood cracking and the warmth spreading through the cabin was immediately comforting. I decided to explore the surrounding area before night fell. The sun was still high, casting long shadows through the dense forest. I wandered down a faint trail that ran behind the cabin. The ground was soft under my boots, covered in pine needles and fallen leaves. Birds called occasionally, and I could hear the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. For a while, it was peaceful, the kind of peace that makes you almost forget you are alone. Almost. As the sun began to dip, the shadows lengthened, and the forest changed its character. What had been comforting and serene began to feel heavy, oppressive. The trail twisted into narrow paths, some disappearing behind dense thickets. I turned back toward the cabin, but something felt off. The sound of the wind in the trees was sharper, and there was a low hum, almost like distant movement. I shrugged it off as nerves. I had been alone in nature before, and I knew that the forest had its own sounds, its own life. Night came quickly. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sky had darkened, and a faint fog began creeping through the trees. I lit the stove again, making the fire brighter, and cooked a simple meal from canned beans and bread. The warmth of the cabin contrasted sharply with the chill creeping in from the windows. I cleaned up, washed my hands in the cold stream water, and settled in by the fire with a small lantern. Hours passed quietly. I read a few pages from a book I had brought, then stared into the flames, letting my mind wander. That's when I first heard it, a faint sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees. Then it came again, a scraping, soft but deliberate, like something brushing against bark or stone. My pulse quickened. I reminded myself that there were plenty of animals in these woods. Deer, raccoons, even bears in the distance. Still, something in the way it repeated made me uneasy. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just letting my imagination run wild. I closed my eyes for a moment, only to open them and see shadows shifting just beyond the dim light of the cabin. There was nothing there, no distinct shape, but the feeling of being watched settled over me like a weight. I sat up straighter, my heart beating faster. Every creak of the cabin, every snap of a branch outside, made me flinch. Hours dragged on. I stayed close to the fire, staring at the door, the windows, the dark forest beyond. The sounds outside grew bolder. Footsteps, soft at first, then heavier, moving in a deliberate pattern. I realized with a sinking feeling that they weren't just random animal sounds. Someone, or something, was circling the cabin. Panic started to rise, but I forced myself to think clearly. There was a window at the back, an emergency exit if I needed it. My phone had no signal, so calling for help was impossible. I would have to wait until morning if I wanted to leave safely, but I knew that staying in the cabin with whoever or whatever was outside was incredibly dangerous. I gathered some firewood, stacking it so that I could keep the fire going as long as possible. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and held it loosely in my hand, knowing it wasn't much, but it was something. I moved quietly to the back door and peered through the small window. The fog had thickened, making visibility difficult, but I could make out a figure, or what seemed like a figure, moving slowly between the trees. My stomach sank. Whoever it was knew I was here. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional scraping or snap outside. I stayed awake the entire night, too alert to sleep, too aware of every sound and shadow. My mind replayed every horror scenario I had ever imagined, each one seeming more real in the dim light of the cabin. When the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I felt a tiny surge of relief. Daylight always made the forest less menacing, less alive in that silent, waiting way. I didn't waste a moment. I grabbed my bag, packed my essentials, and opened the door slowly. The figure from last night was gone, but there were footprints in the soft ground around the cabin. Human footprints. They led away from the cabin, toward the trail I had walked the day before. Whoever had been there had been careful, moving in the shadows at night, but they hadn't covered their tracks. I didn't wait to think. I walked briskly to my car, keeping my eyes on the forest, scanning for movement. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me jump, but I didn't look back. When I reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling, and started the engine. The hum of the vehicle was a comfort, a small protective bubble in the wilderness. I packed quickly, keeping my eyes on the surrounding trees. Every sound of movement made my heart jump. The forest seemed almost alive, every rustle amplified by the tension in my mind. I locked up the cabin as best I could and started the car. The engine roared to life, and I drove slowly, scanning the sides of the road, feeling the weight of the forest pressing in from every angle. Nothing followed. The footprints had not crossed the driveway, and nothing was visible beyond the trees. Still, I felt as if I had been watched the entire time, every step, every movement. The road twisted and turned, and I stayed alert, unwilling to relax even slightly. By midday, I had driven several miles out of the forest. The trees thinned, the road widened, and signs of human habitation began to appear. Mailboxes, power lines, distant rooftops. I felt a strange relief, a lightness in my chest, but also a lingering fear, a sense that the cabin and the forest held something unknowable that I had narrowly escaped. I stopped at a small store on the side of the road, bought water and food, and sat outside, breathing, trying to process the terror of the past 2 nights. I knew I would never return to that cabin. The forest, beautiful as it was, had shown a side that was dangerous, silent, and unpredictable. Later, I contacted the owner to explain what had happened. They seemed surprised but not entirely dismissive. The area, they said, was known for occasional bear activity, sometimes wolves, and even large moose, especially after storms. I realized then how close I had come to a serious encounter. The footprints, the circling, the nocturnal movement, everything aligned with a large, potentially predatory animal, or a confused moose driven near the cabin by the storm. Understanding that it wasn't supernatural didn't ease the fear, but it gave a clear lesson. Nature, even in its quiet beauty, can be terrifying, indifferent, and deadly. That night, safe in a small motel miles away from the cabin, I lay awake, reflecting. The storm, the footprints, the eerie circling, I would never forget it. I resolved never to ignore safety in remote areas again. The forest had taught me respect, and I carried that lesson forward, not as a story to scare others, but as a reminder that isolation in nature demands preparation, vigilance, and humility. That trip, meant to be a peaceful retreat, had turned into a trial, and I had survived it with only fear and a sharper awareness of the wild world outside human comfort. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. The idea of getting away from the city, from the constant hum of cars and the relentless flicker of streetlights, was all I could think about. The cabin was tucked away in a remote part of the forest, far from anything resembling civilization. It was a simple wooden structure, built decades ago, and the owner had assured me that it had everything I needed for a quiet week. A wood stove, running water, and enough firewood stacked to last several nights. The drive had been long, winding through narrow roads that seemed to disappear into the trees. As I turned the last corner and caught my first glimpse of the cabin, sitting alone in a small clearing, a mix of relief and anticipation washed over me. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of pine and damp earth, and the sky was a soft orange from the late afternoon sun. I spent the first hour unpacking and getting familiar with the space. The cabin was small but cozy. The floorboards creaked slightly under my weight, and the walls were lined with shelves of books and old trinkets. A small table sat by the window with 2 chairs, and a wood stove dominated one corner of the room. I stacked firewood nearby and tested the stove, pleased to see it working perfectly. The kitchen was modest. A sink, a small stove, and a fridge that hummed quietly. Everything was as the owner had promised. Outside, the forest stretched in every direction, dense and quiet, except for the occasional chirp of birds or rustle of small animals. The first night passed without incident. I had a small dinner, read a book, and went to bed early. The cabin felt isolated, but in a comforting way. I slept deeply, undisturbed except for the occasional sound of branches scraping against the windows in the wind. The next morning, I awoke to the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the curtains and the distant sound of a creek running somewhere in the forest. I made coffee, stepped outside, and let the air wash over me. Everything seemed perfect, untouched by the rush and noise of the city. For the first few days, I explored the surrounding forest. There were trails that seemed to weave in endless loops, some marked by faint signs of previous hikers, others wild and overgrown. I hiked during the day, always making sure to note my path, and returned to the cabin before nightfall. The isolation was profound, but I didn't mind it. In fact, it felt liberating. The only sounds were natural. Wind through the trees, birdsong, the occasional crack of a distant branch. I felt connected to something older, something timeless. The nights were longer and darker than I was used to, and the woods seemed to stretch endlessly beyond the cabin, shadowed and deep. On the 4th day, the weather shifted. It started with clouds rolling in from the west, gray and heavy, and by mid-afternoon, a cold wind had begun to blow through the trees. I was inside, reading and keeping the stove burning, when I noticed that the forest outside looked different. The usual gentle sway of the trees was replaced by a restless tossing of branches. Leaves and small twigs were swept across the clearing by gusts of wind that seemed to come from nowhere. I went to the window and watched for a while, sipping coffee, feeling a sense of unease that I couldn't quite place. The wind carried an odd sharpness, a smell of wet earth and decaying leaves, and the sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if it was holding its breath. By evening, the wind had grown stronger. I had lit the stove fully, piled more wood onto it, and kept close to the warmth. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, though logically, I knew there was nothing and no one nearby. The cabin groaned with the wind, the wood expanding and contracting with each gust. I tried to focus on reading, but the sense of being watched, of the forest pressing in closer, was growing. Every shadow seemed heavier, every sound more pronounced. I reminded myself that it was just the wind, just the isolation, just my imagination. I checked the perimeter of the cabin from the inside. Nothing moved beyond the trees except the shadows and the wind-blown leaves. Still, I felt uneasy. It was subtle at first, a prickling at the back of my neck, then a weight in my chest, as if the forest itself were breathing and watching me. That night, sleep was uneasy. The wind had intensified into something closer to a storm. Rain began to tap against the roof, light at first, then heavy, pounding in relentless sheets. Branches scraped along the walls and windows, and somewhere in the distance, a tree cracked and fell with a thundering crash that made me jump. I lay in bed, fully clothed, the blankets pulled over my shoulders, listening. My mind kept returning to the sound of something heavier than wind moving outside, something brushing against trees, shifting branches, breaking sticks in ways the wind could not account for. I told myself it was an animal, perhaps a deer or a moose, or even a bear wandering near the cabin. That explanation should have been enough, but it wasn't. I didn't sleep well. At some point, I woke to complete darkness, the storm raging, and a low, distant sound that didn't belong to wind or rain. It was rhythmic, deliberate, a crunching, scraping noise, like something walking across undergrowth, moving closer and closer. My heart raced. I considered going to check, but the thought of stepping outside into the storm, into unknown terrain with something moving near the cabin, terrified me. I stayed where I was, straining to hear. The sound stopped for a moment, then began again, slower, deliberate, right outside one of the windows. My mind ran through possibilities, none of them reassuring. I tried to stay rational. Animals could make noises like this, I reminded myself, but the sound was too precise, too intentional. It circled the cabin, or so it seemed, stopping sometimes, listening, then moving again. The shadows cast by the flickering stove light danced across the walls, and I felt the cabin shrink around me, walls closing in, the forest pressing nearer with every passing second. Morning finally arrived, though gray and rain-soaked. The forest was still, drenched and heavy with moisture, dripping and glistening. I went outside to assess the situation. The storm had uprooted several small trees, and debris was scattered across the clearing. I saw no tracks at first, but then I noticed them, large, heavy footprints pressed into the mud around the cabin. They were too large to be human, too deep, almost clawed. My stomach dropped. I traced them with my eyes, and they seemed to circle the cabin and disappear into the forest. Panic rose in me, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. I needed to think clearly. I made a plan. I would leave the cabin today. I would gather my things, drive back toward civilization, and not look back. This had gone beyond simple unease. It was dangerous. I knew enough about bears and large wildlife to know that I had narrowly escaped an encounter that could have been fatal. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea had started as something small, a weekend away from the city, a quiet break to reconnect with nature. But over time, I had built it up in my head. I wanted isolation, the kind that makes the city feel like a distant memory, the kind where the only sound is the wind through the trees or the occasional bird call. I found a cabin tucked deep in the woods, advertised as off-grid, remote, private. Pictures showed a small wooden structure, rustic but solid, with a stone chimney and a small porch overlooking a clearing. The surrounding forest looked dense, the kind that absorbs sound and blocks light. I booked it immediately. The drive out was long. Hours of highway turning into smaller roads, then dirt tracks, and finally a narrow path barely wide enough for my car. The sun was low, spilling orange light through the trees, and I felt a thrill I had not felt in years. Each turn took me deeper into the wilderness, and the more isolated I felt, the more alive I felt. My phone's signal disappeared entirely before the last mile. I didn't mind. In fact, I wanted it that way. The silence was part of the escape. The cabin looked exactly as it did in the pictures. The wood smelled faintly of pine, and the stone chimney was blackened with years of smoke. I parked, unloaded my things, and did a full inspection. Everything was in working order. The stove, the water pump, the old wood-fired heater. There was firewood stacked neatly against the side of the cabin, and the windows had thick curtains. The air smelled of damp earth, moss, and wood. I set my things down and walked to the porch. The clearing around the cabin was wider than I expected, framed by tall pine and oak trees, and I could hear the faint rustle of branches and the occasional crack of a twig from some animal moving in the forest. The first night was uneventful, but I was hyper-aware. Every sound felt amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the wind brushing against the walls, the thump of a branch hitting the roof. I had brought a small flashlight, a first aid kit, canned food, and extra blankets, though I didn't expect to need them. Still, every time I moved, I felt eyes on me, though I knew it was just nerves. I fell asleep eventually, but not without a lingering unease. The second day, I decided to explore the forest around the cabin. I wanted to find a stream or a vantage point, something that made the isolation worth it. The trees grew closer together as I went further, and I noticed that the sounds from the cabin, birds, wind, distant cars, were replaced by the crunch of my boots on the undergrowth and the occasional snap of twigs under some small animal's feet. It was easy to lose a sense of direction. Every time I thought I was heading north, the terrain would shift in a way that made me question it. I realized how easy it would be to get lost here. The forest was dense, uniform, with no distinct landmarks except for one giant oak tree that seemed to pierce the sky. I marked it mentally as my reference point. By late afternoon, I had walked nearly 3 miles from the cabin. The forest felt more oppressive. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and I noticed how quickly the light faded under the canopy. I turned back toward the oak tree, planning to retrace my steps, but as I walked, the path seemed different. The undergrowth was thicker, the ground uneven, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had not been paying attention. I was off the trail. Panic set in, not full-blown, but the kind that creeps in slowly, tightening around your chest. I tried to retrace my steps, looking for familiar markers. A broken branch, a patch of moss, anything. But every tree looked the same. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every sound seemed amplified. I could hear something moving, distant but deliberate. A rustling not quite like the small animals I had seen before. I stopped, scanning the forest. Nothing, but I felt watched. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself. I had a map and a compass, but I realized that relying solely on them was tricky in such dense forest. Hours passed as I wandered, trying to find my way back. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest darkened faster than I expected. My flashlight was dead. I had packed extra batteries, but I couldn't find them in the dark, fumbling through my pack. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees, making the branches creak and rattle. I found a small hollow beneath a large tree and decided to wait, to conserve energy and think. Sitting there, I felt completely exposed, utterly alone. The thought of spending the night out in the open without proper gear terrified me. Every small noise, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, felt like a predator moving closer. Eventually, I remembered the fire-starting kit I had brought. I built a small fire using dry leaves and twigs, and sat as close to it as I dared without burning myself. The light and warmth brought some comfort, but the fear remained. I realized that staying put until daylight was my safest option. My mind raced, imagining every possible scenario. Getting lost forever, falling and breaking a bone, running into a wild animal. Each thought made the forest seem more threatening, more alive, more dangerous. I stayed awake all night, dozing lightly between fits of panic. Every crack and snap kept me alert. Morning was slow to come. When it finally did, the forest looked different, almost deceptive in its calm. I retraced my steps carefully, using the sun as a guide and following the markers I had noticed the day before. Hours passed, and I felt exhaustion setting in. My legs weak and blistered, my hands raw from moving through branches. By midday, I spotted the clearing where the cabin stood. Relief hit me like a wave. I rushed forward, stumbling over roots and rocks, until I finally saw the cabin in front of me. I reached it panting, bruised, and dirty. The sight of it, the solid walls, the familiar porch, the stacked firewood, felt like salvation. I collapsed on the porch, unable to move for several minutes, just staring at the forest that had seemed so threatening and alien. I spent the next day recovering, but the experience had changed me. I moved slowly, checking every corner, making sure doors were locked and windows secure. I started keeping a log, noting times, sounds, and anything unusual. I reinforced the cabin's security where I could. Extra locks, stacking firewood against doors, checking windows for gaps. I also realized the importance of preparation. The isolation that I had sought had come with risks I hadn't anticipated. I made a point to keep essentials within reach. Extra water, more batteries, a whistle, a basic medical kit, and tools that could help me navigate the forest. A few days later, I explored again, but this time with extreme caution. I mapped the area meticulously, marking trails with biodegradable tape and taking notes of landmarks. Unusual trees, rocks, and clearings. I realized that respecting the forest's scale and complexity was essential. It wasn't threatening in itself, but my lack of preparation and awareness had made it so. By the end of the week, I had learned to read the subtle signs of movement, weather changes, and animal tracks. When it was finally time to leave, I packed slowly, double-checked everything, and walked back to my car with a newfound respect for isolation and survival. I looked back at the cabin, standing quietly in the clearing, and felt a strange mix of gratitude and awe. It had been terrifying, yes, but it had also taught me resilience, patience, and the importance of preparation. The forest was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of understanding, something I had earned through careful observation and respect. Driving back towards civilization, I realized that the fear I had experienced wasn't about monsters or ghosts. It was about vulnerability, about facing the raw, indifferent world alone. The relief and sense of accomplishment I felt were deep, lasting, and real. I knew I would return one day, better prepared and more aware, but for now, I carried a clear lesson. Isolation can be terrifying, but it can also reveal strength you didn't know you had. The cabin, the forest, the long night of fear, all of it had ended safely, and that clarity, that tangible sense of survival, was worth more than any thrill I had imagined. When I reached the road, I saw the first car in hours, and relief washed over me. I didn't stop to think, didn't look back. I flagged it down and explained as best as I could what had happened, my words tumbling out in a jumble. The driver called the authorities, and within an hour, someone was with me, checking the cabin. It turned out that the area had been used by poachers. They had set up temporary camps in the forest, and while they weren't there that night, the signs of their presence, footprints, discarded food containers, the careful snapping of branches to warn each other, explained the sounds that had terrified me. Nothing supernatural, nothing magical, just human beings, dangerous and careful, using the forest like a trap. The authorities confirmed the cabin was abandoned and cleared out. I stayed with a friend for a few days, unable to stop thinking about that night. The fear had been real, but so had the relief. I realized that the forest, the cabin, the isolation, it wasn't the problem. The problem was people who used fear and shadows to hide their own activities. I went back later with permission during daylight to collect my belongings. The forest was calm, the creek still, and the cabin seemed harmless in the sun. I packed carefully, taking photos of the area and the trail, keeping evidence of the poachers. It was over, the danger gone, but the memory stayed with me. The forest had taught me respect, a cautious awareness, and the lesson that fear often comes not from the unknown, but from the hidden presence of human threat. I left the cabin for the last time, the sunlight cutting through the trees, and felt a quiet relief, a certainty that I had faced a real danger and come through it intact. I remember the drive out to the cabin like it was yesterday. The road was narrow, barely more than a strip of asphalt winding through dense forest, with trees pressing close on either side. Sunlight fought its way through the leaves in thin streaks, but by the time I reached the final stretch, the light had started to fade, and a gray, heavy cloud cover made the woods feel darker than they really were. My heart had been light earlier that day, full of excitement and anticipation, but by the time I turned onto the dirt path that led to the cabin, a quiet tension had settled in my chest. I hadn't told anyone I was going alone. I wanted the isolation, the silence, the chance to be completely disconnected from the chaos of the city. Looking back, I realized that desire blinded me to the warning signs that were all around. The cabin itself was nothing spectacular from the outside, just a small wooden structure with weathered siding, a stone chimney, and windows that reflected the fading light in dull, greenish-gray hues. It was nestled in a clearing, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. A shallow creek ran along one edge of the clearing, the water dark and murky, but its gentle gurgle was calming as I parked the car and stepped out. The air smelled like wet earth and decaying leaves, and a sharp wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of moss and something faintly metallic that I didn't recognize. I shrugged off a small shiver and hauled my bag to the cabin door. The lock was rusty but functional, and the door groaned in protest when I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and mildew. Dust hung in the air like a thin fog, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. There were signs of past use: old furniture, a cast-iron stove, a stack of firewood neatly piled by the fireplace. But it was clear that no one had been here recently. The windows were grimy, and the glass in one corner had a faint crack running through it, spiderweb-like. I set my bag down and began to take stock. The cabin had electricity, though it flickered weakly when I switched the light on, and a small pile of newspapers from months ago lay on a table, yellowed and brittle. There was a fridge, a small bed in the corner, and a couple of chairs that looked like they hadn't been sat in for years. I decided to start by getting a fire going. The fireplace was big enough to warm the whole cabin, and the wood looked dry enough. I laid the kindling carefully, struck a match, and watched as the flames grew, the heat quickly filling the small space. The sound of the fire crackling was oddly comforting, but it also seemed loud in the silence of the woods. I ate a small meal I had brought, beans and rice heated over the stove, and then settled in to read for a while. The sun dipped below the horizon, and shadows filled the corners of the room, twisting and lengthening as the firelight flickered. By the time I went to bed, the night was fully descended. I slept on the thin mattress on the floor, the sheets rough but tolerable. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows and making the trees moan. At first, I told myself it was just the wind, just the natural sounds of the forest, but then I began to notice other noises. A snapping of branches, a scraping sound against the siding, something that sounded like footsteps circling the cabin. I tried to rationalize it, maybe an animal, a raccoon or a deer, but the noises were too deliberate, too purposeful. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my ears straining for any repetition, any sign that whatever it was had left. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The air was damp and cold, and the forest seemed denser the deeper I went. I followed the creek upstream for a while, watching the water swirl around rocks and fallen branches. Birds called from the treetops, but there was a tension in the forest, a feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the tree line, but there was nothing. After a few hours, I returned to the cabin, my clothes damp from dew, and I tried to brush off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. I told myself that isolation always did that to people, made them imagine threats where there were none. By evening, the tension had grown worse. The wind had died down, but the forest was alive with sound. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional heavy thud. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, a presence just beyond the perimeter of the clearing. I checked the windows, looked around the cabin, and made sure all the doors were locked. I even stacked a chair against the main door, an irrational act, but one that brought a small measure of comfort. I ate dinner, though I had little appetite, and tried to focus on the fire, on the light and warmth it gave off. I could hear the sounds moving closer, circling, and every so often, a sharp knock or tap would echo through the cabin walls. I froze each time, heart racing, telling myself it was just a branch or a rock. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The night was the worst. I didn't sleep. I lay on the floor, my back against the wall, listening. Whatever was out there moved with intent, slow and deliberate. At one point, I thought I saw shadows moving past the windows, and my stomach dropped. I wanted to leave, to run back to the road, but the idea of stepping outside in the dark, alone, terrified me more. I stayed pressed against the wall, holding a heavy cast-iron skillet I had grabbed from the kitchen. Every muscle tensed, every nerve screaming at me to run or fight. The hours crawled by. Every sound was amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the whistle of the wind, the distant rustle of leaves. The presence outside never fully revealed itself, but it made me feel small, cornered, completely exposed. By dawn, exhaustion had set in. I hadn't slept, barely moved, and my mind was frayed. The first rays of sun filtering through the trees were a relief, a reminder that the night, at least, was over. I sat by the window and watched as the forest seemed to calm with the light. The presence that had tormented me all night was gone, or at least hidden in the brightness. I realized then that I needed a plan, that I couldn't just wait for the next night and hope I survived. I decided to walk back to the road and get help if I could, but the path through the forest felt endless. I packed what I needed, grabbed the skillet, and stepped outside. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, but I kept moving, using the creek as a guide until I found the main path. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple at first. Escape the noise of the city, spend a week alone in a remote cabin deep in the forest, and just disconnect from everything. I had been feeling drained, exhausted, and my head was always clouded with work and obligations. A week of solitude, I thought, would clear my mind. I had rented a small wooden cabin that was more than a few hours' drive from the nearest town. It wasn't luxurious. In fact, it was almost bare bones. Just a small living area, a bedroom with a single bed, a tiny bathroom, and a stove for heat and cooking. But it was secluded, surrounded by dense forest, and that was exactly what I wanted. I wanted to be completely alone. The drive there was longer than I expected. The GPS lost signal about 20 miles out from the main road, and after that, I had to navigate a series of dirt tracks that wound through the trees. The forest seemed endless, with tall pines that blocked the sky in some places, and thick underbrush that clawed at the sides of the car. The road was rough, full of potholes and rocks, and I had to drive slowly. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, bleeding orange light through the tree trunks, and the forest seemed alive with shadows. There were no signs of other people, no sound of cars or motorcycles, just the constant rustling of leaves in the wind. The cabin appeared at the end of a narrow clearing, small, square, and wooden. Its roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the paint had faded to a dull gray over the years. Yet it had a solid, sturdy look, as if it had been built to last decades, maybe longer. I parked and stepped out, stretching my stiff legs. The air was cold, but clean. There was no smell of smoke or industry, just the faint scent of pine and earth. I carried my bag inside, locking the door behind me. The cabin smelled faintly of dust and wood, with a damp undertone, like the walls had absorbed years of moisture. I set my bag down and explored. The furniture was minimal. A small wooden table, 2 chairs, a single bed with a thin mattress, a dresser, and a stove in the corner. There was a small pile of firewood stacked neatly beside the stove, and a metal bucket that I assumed was for water. The bathroom was tiny, with an old toilet and a shower that looked like it hadn't been used in months, maybe years. I unpacked a few essentials: clothes, food, a lantern, and a small first aid kit. The rest I left in my bag. I made a small fire in the stove, just enough to warm the room, and sat down on the bed, letting the quiet settle over me. At first, the silence was comforting, almost meditative. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves outside, the distant call of a bird, the sound of my own breathing. It was a relief to be away from the constant chatter and noise of the city. For a while, I just stared out the window, watching the light fade completely and the forest turn dark. By the time night fully set in, I felt a creeping unease. It was subtle at first, just a sense that I wasn't entirely alone, even though I knew I was. The wind rustled through the trees, making the shadows move across the cabin walls, and every sound seemed amplified. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and my mind was playing tricks. I went to bed early, trying to ignore the feeling, but I slept poorly. Every small noise woke me. A branch snapping, a door creaking under its own weight, a low thump from the ceiling. I eventually drifted into a light sleep, half dreaming, half aware of every sound. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The cabin was colder than I expected, and the fire had gone out. I dressed quickly and went outside to explore the surroundings. The forest was dense, with no clear paths beyond the small clearing where the cabin stood. I could see the rough dirt track that led to the cabin, but it disappeared quickly into the trees. I walked slowly, taking note of landmarks. A large boulder near the edge of the clearing, a dead tree with a hollow trunk, a small creek I hadn't noticed the night before. I wanted to map my surroundings so I wouldn't get lost. I spent the day walking carefully, always listening for movement, always scanning the trees. The forest seemed alive with subtle sounds, faint rustling that could be animals or something else. I tried to remain rational. It was deep in the wilderness. Wildlife was natural. Predators were everywhere. Still, there was a tension I couldn't shake. That night, the unease returned in full force. I had eaten a small meal, lit the stove, and tried to read a book, but my focus kept drifting to the window. There was something outside, something moving just beyond the clearing. I convinced myself it was a deer, maybe a fox, but then I heard it. A soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the dirt. Not random, not like an animal walking. Someone or something was walking around the cabin. My stomach tightened. I checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked and closed. I tried to listen carefully, pressing my ear against the window. The sound stopped. I waited, frozen, every muscle tense. Then, after a long pause, I heard it again. Footsteps circling, moving slowly, carefully. Whoever it was knew I was inside. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept the fire going, pacing the cabin, listening to the occasional sound outside. It was as if the forest itself had changed. The usual wind rustling and bird calls were gone, replaced by something deliberate, something watching. I considered leaving, but I was too far from the main road. If someone was outside, I had no way to know what they wanted. I told myself to remain calm, to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hiker, a hunter, someone lost like me. But the thought didn't ease my fear. By dawn, I was exhausted, jittery, and my mind was racing. I didn't want to leave, but I knew I needed to find a way to protect myself. The next day, I took inventory of what I had. I had a small hatchet, a kitchen knife, some matches, a few cans of food, and a limited supply of water. No phone signal, no way to call for help. I realized I needed to be proactive. I reinforced the doors as best I could, moving heavy furniture to block the main door and bracing the windows with chairs. I stayed alert, moving quietly around the cabin, listening for any sound outside. Hours passed. Nothing happened. I felt tense but slightly relieved. Maybe it had just been an animal. Maybe my fear had gotten the better of me. But that evening, the steps returned, louder this time, closer. Someone was clearly outside, walking along the perimeter of the cabin. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the hatchet, moving silently to the back window. There, I saw it. A figure, tall, dressed in dark clothes, moving deliberately. I froze, watching as the figure paused, turning slightly as if scanning the area. Panic hit me, sharp and cold. I had no way out, no way to call for help. I had to think fast. I remembered the creek I had passed the day before. If I could get there, maybe I could use it to obscure my movements, escape into the forest. But I had to wait until the figure left. That night, the unease returned in full force. I had eaten a small meal, lit the stove, and tried to read a book, but my focus kept drifting to the window. There was something outside, something moving just beyond the clearing. I convinced myself it was a deer, maybe a fox, but then I heard it. A soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the dirt. Not random, not like an animal walking. Someone or something was walking around the cabin. My stomach tightened. I checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked and closed. I tried to listen carefully, pressing my ear against the window. The sound stopped. I waited, frozen, every muscle tense. Then, after a long pause, I heard it again. Footsteps circling, moving slowly, carefully. Whoever it was knew I was inside. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept the fire going, pacing the cabin, listening to the occasional sound outside. It was as if the forest itself had changed. The usual wind rustling and bird calls were gone, replaced by something deliberate, something watching. I considered leaving, but I was too far from the main road. If someone was outside, I had no way to know what they wanted. I told myself to remain calm, to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hiker, a hunter, someone lost like me. But the thought didn't ease my fear. By dawn, I was exhausted, jittery, and my mind was racing. I didn't want to leave, but I knew I needed to find a way to protect myself. The next day, I took inventory of what I had. I had a small hatchet, a kitchen knife, some matches, a few cans of food, and a limited supply of water. No phone signal, no way to call for help. I realized I needed to be proactive. I reinforced the doors as best I could, moving heavy furniture to block the main door and bracing the windows with chairs. I stayed alert, moving quietly around the cabin, listening for any sound outside. Hours passed. Nothing happened. I felt tense but slightly relieved. Maybe it had just been an animal. Maybe my fear had gotten the better of me. But that evening, the steps returned, louder this time, closer. Someone was clearly outside, walking along the perimeter of the cabin. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the hatchet, moving silently to the back window. There, I saw it. A figure, tall, dressed in dark clothes, moving deliberately. I froze, watching as the figure paused, turning slightly as if scanning the area. Panic hit me, sharp and cold. I had no way out, no way to call for help. I had to think fast. I remembered the creek I had passed the day before. If I could get there, maybe I could use it to obscure my movements, escape into the forest. But I had to wait until the figure left. The night was long. I stayed crouched by the window, heart pounding, clutching the hatchet, watching as the figure disappeared and returned intermittently. Couldn't sleep. I barely breathed. By early morning, the figure was gone, but I knew I couldn't stay. I spent hours packing what I could carry and making a plan. I would wait for daylight, then move toward the creek, keeping low and quiet. The forest was dense, but I knew it would provide cover. I left small items behind, just taking the essentials. Water, food, the hatchet, and my bag. I moved slowly, scanning constantly. The forest seemed endless, each tree a potential hiding place, each shadow a potential threat. I walked cautiously, never making noise, every step calculated. The creek finally appeared, and I followed it, hoping it would lead me to a road or a sign of civilization. Hours passed. The forest remained oppressive, thick and unyielding, but following the creek gave me a sense of direction. I climbed over fallen logs, waded through shallow water, and avoided areas where the ground seemed unstable. My legs were sore, my arms scratched by branches, my skin wet and cold. The sun rose higher, and I began to feel slightly safer, knowing that the light would make me more visible if anyone were tracking me. Eventually, the creek widened, and I found signs of human activity. A faint trail, discarded cans, tire tracks in the mud. Relief washed over me. I was close to the road. I followed the trail, moving faster now, my body exhausted but my mind focused. After what felt like hours, the trees thinned, and I saw the road in the distance. A car passed by, and I waved frantically, shouting until the driver stopped. They called the authorities while I collapsed on the side of the road, trembling, soaked, and dirty. The police investigated the cabin. They found evidence that someone had been watching me for days, living quietly near the clearing. Tracks, makeshift shelters, discarded food. No one was caught immediately, but the area was secured. I learned later that it was a man who had been living off the forest, observing cabins, taking advantage of isolated travelers. The thought made my stomach turn. I had survived, yes, but it was terrifying to know how close I had come to something far worse. I returned to the city slowly, still shaken, replaying every detail in my mind. The cabin trip, meant to be a peaceful escape, had become a test of patience, caution, and survival. The memory of footsteps circling the cabin, the oppressive silence of the forest, and the isolation still haunted me. But I survived, and that knowledge, as terrifying as the experience was, gave me strength. I realized how vulnerable I was, how quickly calm can turn into fear, and how important preparation, awareness, and courage can be in moments when danger is close, silent, and invisible. In the end, the cabin trip taught me more than I expected. It taught me about limits, endurance, and the unexpected threats that can hide in places we consider safe. It taught me to respect the wilderness, not just for its beauty but for its unpredictability. And it taught me that even when trapped, with careful observation, planning, and calm determination, survival is possible. I never returned to that forest, but I carried the lessons with me. The fear didn't vanish overnight, but it faded, leaving behind a sharper sense of vigilance and respect for the world, and a deep understanding that danger can lurk anywhere, even in places that seem peaceful, quiet, and alone. I survived because I didn't panic. I survived because I acted, and that survival, every scratch, every sleepless hour, every step through the cold water, became a story of endurance, of facing fear head-on, and of ultimately returning to safety with my life intact. I had been driving for hours before I finally saw the sign that marked the turnoff for the cabin. The road had been narrow and winding for miles, flanked by dense forest on either side. The kind of forest that made it feel like the world had ended and left only trees and shadows behind. The sky was overcast, low clouds pressed against the tops of the hills, and the air smelled of wet pine and dirt. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I brushed it off. I told myself that the isolation was part of the point. I had been craving solitude, a place where I could escape emails, calls, and the endless hum of city life. The cabin was supposed to be the perfect getaway. Small, rustic, but fully equipped for comfort. The driveway was overgrown, grass and weeds reaching over the tires of my car, and the gravel crunched loudly under my wheels. The cabin itself was tucked into a clearing, framed by towering oaks and pines. It was old, maybe built 50 years ago, but it had a sturdy look. The wood siding was weathered to a gray-brown, the roof had a few patches, and the porch sagged slightly in the middle. I parked and stepped out, stretching my stiff legs, and the quiet hit me immediately. It was not just the absence of sound. It was the presence of silence, like the forest was holding its breath. I grabbed my bags and pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood and mildew, a combination of old timber and dampness from the surrounding forest. Dust floated in the shafts of light coming through the grimy windows. The cabin had one main room with a small kitchenette to the side, a table with a few mismatched chairs, a stone fireplace, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft. I set my bags down and walked around, checking the locks on the windows and doors. Everything seemed secure, though the front door lock was rusted and stiff. I made a mental note to oil it the next day. The plan was simple. Spend 3 nights alone, write, hike, read, and just disconnect. I unpacked my bag, set up my laptop on the kitchen table, and made myself a cup of coffee. The first night passed uneventfully. I sat in front of the fireplace, the cabin lit only by the weak glow of the lamp and the fire, and I listened to the wind rustle through the trees. Occasionally, I thought I heard something moving outside, a snapping twig, the scrape of a branch against the siding, but each time I looked out, nothing was there. It was easy to dismiss. Animals lived in the woods. That was all. On the second day, I decided to take a long hike. The trail started behind the cabin, cutting through dense underbrush and climbing gradually into the hills. The forest was thick. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in shifting patterns, and the air was moist and cool. I walked for hours, losing myself in the rhythm of my steps, the smell of damp earth and moss, and the occasional distant cry of a bird. I didn't see anyone, not even another hiker. By the time I returned, my legs were sore, my clothes damp with sweat, and the sky had darkened. A storm was coming. I lit the fireplace and settled back into the cabin, drying off. That's when I first noticed it. The sound was subtle at first, almost a whisper against the wind. It was a scratching, faint but persistent, coming from somewhere outside. At first, I thought it was branches scraping against the cabin, but the noise had a rhythm that didn't match the wind. It was deliberate, steady. My stomach tightened, and I forced myself to reason it out. Animals, probably a raccoon or a stray deer scratching against the wood. Nothing more. I closed the curtains, made dinner, and tried to ignore it. By nightfall, the storm hit. Rain hammered the roof, wind whipped through the trees, and lightning illuminated the cabin in sharp, blinding flashes. The scratching had stopped, or maybe I just couldn't hear it over the storm. I tried to sleep, but the wind made the cabin groan and creak, and every time I dozed off, a sudden snap of a branch or a crash of thunder jolted me awake. I realized that isolation had a price. It made every sound, no matter how ordinary, seem like a threat. The third day was eerily calm. The storm had passed, leaving the forest damp and quiet. I went out to inspect the cabin and the surrounding area. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint in the muddy ground near the porch. Small, human-like, but not deep enough to be adult-sized. I froze, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The air felt heavier, oppressive, like the forest was closing in. My mind raced with possibilities. Hikers, vandals, or worse. I checked the doors and windows again, making sure everything was locked. I didn't want to overreact, but the footprints had left a knot of fear in my stomach. That night, I stayed near the fireplace with a heavy flashlight on the table. Every creak, every whisper of wind, every distant snap of a branch made me flinch. Then it happened. I heard the scratching again, this time from the side of the cabin. I could tell it wasn't the wind. I grabbed my flashlight and edged toward the door, careful not to make noise. The beam swept across the side, revealing nothing. But the scratching continued, moving slowly along the wall. My heart was hammering in my chest. I realized with a sinking feeling that something or someone was outside. I didn't leave the cabin that night. I stayed in the main room, flashlight in hand, listening. The scratching stopped after a few hours, replaced by faint footsteps circling the cabin. The sound was careful, deliberate, as if whoever was out there didn't want to be seen but wanted me to know they were there. I barely slept, dozing only in short bursts, my ears straining for the slightest noise. The next morning, I inspected the perimeter. There were new footprints, larger this time, leading away from the cabin into the trees. I followed them cautiously for a short distance but found nothing. Whoever had been there had vanished. The realization made me both anxious and relieved. They hadn't broken in, hadn't threatened me directly. But the idea that someone had been outside while I slept, watching, left me unsettled. I spent the day keeping busy. Cleaning, checking the locks, hiking only along the cabin trail. Every shadow made me jump. Every rustle of leaves had my heart in my throat. I knew I needed to stay calm, to maintain reason. Could be a lost hiker, a local checking on the property, anyone. But the fear was hard to shake. That night, I prepared for the worst. I moved a chair to block the front door, put a heavy kitchen knife within reach, and arranged the flashlight beside me. I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I heard it again. Scratching, footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. But this time, I stayed calm. I didn't react immediately. I waited, listening, watching. The scratching moved to the back of the cabin, then paused. Long minutes passed. I realized that whoever it was had stopped at the rear window. The glass was old, slightly fogged, but I could see a shadow, a figure crouched, moving cautiously. I held my breath, waiting. The figure stayed there for perhaps a minute, then moved away, disappearing into the trees. I felt a surge of adrenaline but also relief. I wasn't directly attacked. Whoever it was had simply been curious or cautious. I continued moving, trying to stay calm. Darkness fell quickly, swallowing the forest in black. I had no choice but to find a place to spend the night. I stumbled upon a shallow depression, gathered leaves and branches, and huddled there, using my jacket as a blanket. I listened to the forest, every sound amplified in the darkness. The footsteps, the rustling, the occasional distant howl of an animal. It all made my stomach twist in fear. I stayed awake until dawn, exhausted and terrified. When morning came, I was weak, but I had a new determination. I followed the creek I had discovered near the cabin, hoping it would lead me somewhere familiar. The trek was long, and hunger and thirst gnawed at me, but eventually, after what felt like endless hours, I heard the distant hum of a road. I followed it and, finally, saw a car driving along it. I waved frantically, and the driver stopped. They gave me water, a snack, and a phone to call for help. Relief washed over me in a wave I hadn't felt in days. The police found the cabin later, and my fears were confirmed. Someone had been living in the woods near it. They had broken in at night, hiding nearby, observing anyone who came close. There were signs of long-term habitation, makeshift shelters, discarded food, and evidence of fires. The person was eventually apprehended in a nearby town, and they admitted to stalking the cabin and its occupants. It was a terrifying revelation, but I felt a deep sense of closure. I had survived, escaped, and finally understood the danger that had lurked just beyond the walls. Returning home, I felt a mix of exhaustion, relief, and lingering anxiety. I didn't take the forest for granted anymore. Every noise, every shadow, every step in the woods held meaning. But I also felt stronger, more aware of my instincts and more confident in my ability to survive. The cabin trip had been a nightmare in many ways, but it had also given me clarity. I had faced real fear, survived it, and returned with a story that would remind me of the fragility of solitude and the strength it takes to escape real danger. On the third night, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the trees, bending them with a force that made the cabin shudder. Rain hammered against the roof, leaking through the cracks in sheets that soaked the floor. I spent hours mopping up water, reinforcing weak spots with pieces of wood I had salvaged from the porch. The storm lasted all night, and in the morning, the forest was a mess of fallen branches and broken trees. One of the larger trees had fallen perilously close to the cabin, its roots ripped from the ground. I realized that if I had arrived a few hours later, I might not have had the chance to escape unscathed. That day, I ventured slightly farther from the cabin to assess the damage. The forest floor was treacherous, slick with mud and fallen leaves. I noticed more tracks, larger this time, some closer to the cabin than I expected. They were irregular, dragging in some places, as if whoever or whatever had made them had been carrying something heavy. I followed them for a short distance, careful to remain hidden, but they led to nothing, no sign of a person or animal. The tracks disappeared into a thick grove of trees, leaving only uncertainty behind. I returned to the cabin, exhausted and anxious. That night, I made sure the fire was strong and the lanterns fully fueled. I double-checked the doors and windows, placing the axe where it could be grabbed quickly. Sleep was again elusive, and when I finally drifted off, it was interrupted by the sound of footsteps circling the cabin. This time, I was certain it wasn't an animal. The steps were too heavy, too deliberate, too calculated. I gripped the axe, my body tense, my mind racing through every possible scenario. Morning came, bringing light but little relief. I inspected the perimeter of the cabin and found evidence of someone having been there. Small indentations in the dirt where someone had knelt, faint smudges on the windows, marks on the door frame. Whoever had been outside had been careful not to leave obvious traces, but I could see the signs. Fear mixed with determination. I couldn't stay here unprepared. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin as best I could, stacking firewood against the windows, sharpening the axe, and preparing traps that could alert me to movement around the perimeter. I even gathered rocks and sticks, small weapons I could throw if necessary. Over the following days, I kept to a strict routine. I limited my movements outside, kept the fire burning, and remained vigilant. The sense of being watched never left, but I grew more adept at noticing subtle signs. The way a branch bent too much, the impression of a footprint pressed in mud, a faint glimmer of metal that could be a flashlight. Each night, I made small improvements to the cabin's defenses, reinforcing weak points and ensuring I could barricade myself inside if needed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. My heart raced as I grabbed the axe, but the sound was unmistakably a truck engine. A group of hikers from a nearby ranger station had spotted smoke from my fire and were driving through the forest to check on me. Relief flooded through me in waves, dissolving the months of tension and fear. I ran to the cabin door, waving frantically. They parked nearby and quickly assessed the situation, noting the signs of someone having been around the cabin and the damage from the storm. I explained as best I could, but words felt inadequate. The hikers helped me pack my supplies and escorted me back to the main road. As we drove through the forest, I kept looking back at the cabin, half in disbelief that I had survived intact. The isolation, the fear, the constant vigilance, all of it had been terrifying, but I had endured. That night, in a proper bed in town, I finally slept deeply, the sounds of civilization washing over me like a bomb. The memory of the cabin stayed with me. The eerie noises, the footprints, the storm, but it no longer held power over me. I had faced the fear of complete isolation and survived. The experience left me changed. I had learned how fragile safety can be, how quickly ordinary places can become dangerous when solitude isolates you from help. I kept the memories with me, detailed in my mind like a journal, each sense and moment etched clearly. The cabin was no longer just a place on a map. It was a test of endurance, awareness, and resilience, and I had passed it. I had been planning this solo trip for months. The stress from work had been piling up, and the constant noise of the city had started to weigh me down in a way that felt physical. The idea of a cabin deep in the mountains, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence, sounded like the perfect escape. I wanted to get away from the constant hum of electronics, the relentless chatter of people, and the endless responsibilities that seemed to multiply by the day. I found a cabin online, listed on a small vacation rental site. It wasn't advertised as anything fancy, just a simple wooden cabin tucked away at the end of a long dirt road. It had a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and enough space for 1 or 2 people. The pictures showed a cozy place, with a porch that looked out onto a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. I booked it immediately. The drive up to the cabin was longer than I expected. The road narrowed after the town, turning from asphalt to gravel, then to dirt tracks that twisted through the thick trees. At first, the drive was peaceful. The autumn leaves painted the forest in shades of orange, yellow, and red, and I felt the tight knot in my chest begin to loosen as I drove further away from civilization. But as the miles passed, the isolation started to settle over me in a way that was almost tangible. The road was so narrow in some places that I had to slow to a crawl to avoid scraping the sides of my car against trees or rocks. Occasionally, the path would dip into small valleys where water had washed parts of the road away, leaving deep ruts that made me worry about getting stuck. By the time I saw the cabin, the sun was low in the sky. The clearing around it was small, just enough space for the cabin and a fire pit in front of the porch. The cabin itself looked older than the photos suggested, with the wood darkened and slightly weathered. The windows were clean, and smoke was rising lazily from the chimney, which made me assume someone had been there recently. My stomach tightened with anticipation as I parked and stepped out. The air was cool, crisp, and smelled of pine and wet earth. I could hear nothing but the wind in the trees and the faint scurrying of small animals in the underbrush. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was just as the pictures had shown. A small living area with a sofa, a wood stove, a kitchen table, and a loft above that served as a sleeping area. There was a sense of simplicity to the place that immediately put me at ease. I set down my bags and lit the stove. It took some effort to get the fire going. The wood was damp, but eventually, the room filled with warmth and the faint scent of burning pine. I unpacked the bare necessities, set up a few candles around the cabin for soft light, and settled into the quiet. The first night was peaceful. I ate a simple dinner of canned soup warmed over the stove and drank a cup of tea while sitting on the porch, looking out at the forest as the sun disappeared behind the trees. The shadows deepened, the sky turned a deep indigo, and the forest around me seemed to stretch endlessly. It was calming in a way that I had not felt in years. I went to bed in the loft, the wood creaking slightly beneath me as I climbed the ladder. I slept soundly, the sound of the wind in the trees lulling me to a deep rest. The next morning, I woke early, feeling refreshed. I had planned to spend the day hiking, exploring the trails near the cabin. I had brought a map I printed from the internet, along with a compass, extra water, and some snacks. The forest was beautiful in the morning light. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting long, moving shadows on the ground. Birds called to one another, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush hinted at deer or other small wildlife. I followed one of the trails that ran along a small creek. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places, and uneven, but I enjoyed the challenge. There was a sense of complete solitude that I relished. As I hiked, I noticed the quiet more acutely. It wasn't just the absence of people or cars. Even the forest seemed to move differently here. There were no distant sounds of construction, no hum of electricity, no planes overhead. Everything felt slower, heavier, more deliberate. I started to pay attention to small details. The way the moss clung to the north side of trees, the pattern of leaves on the forest floor, the occasional broken branch that suggested the passage of a large animal. Around midday, I stopped near the creek to eat and refill my water. I sat on a rock, feeling the sun warm my back, and listened to the faint trickle of the water over stones. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. After lunch, I continued down the trail, following it deeper into the forest. The path became less defined. Tree roots crossed the trail, fallen branches blocked the way, and the occasional marker I had been following disappeared entirely. I double-checked my map and compass, trying to confirm my location. I realized that I might have strayed farther than I intended. The thought was a little unsettling, but I felt confident I could retrace my steps. I turned around, but almost immediately, I noticed something strange. The landmarks I remembered passing seemed subtly different. A tree that had been to my left was now on my right. A boulder I had passed was missing. My stomach tightened. I tried to calm myself, reasoning that I had simply misremembered the route. I walked back along what I thought was the same path, but the feeling of unease grew. Shadows seemed longer, the wind sounded sharper, and the forest seemed quieter, almost deliberately so. I started to notice small details I had not seen before. Fresh footprints in the mud that weren't mine, broken branches at waist height, and a faint smell of smoke on the air. I paused, listening. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, yet the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. Hours passed as I tried to find the trail back to the cabin. I checked my compass constantly, trying to reconcile my location with the map. The forest seemed to twist and fold in ways that made no sense, and every path I took seemed to loop back toward the same clearing. Panic began to creep in. My water was running low, my legs were sore from constant walking, and the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon. I knew I needed to find shelter soon. By the time the sky had turned a deep orange, I spotted the faint outline of the cabin in a small clearing ahead. Relief washed over me. I ran the last few hundred meters, nearly tripping over roots and rocks, and stumbled onto the porch. I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the sofa, exhausted. I tried to calm my racing heart, taking deep breaths, telling myself I had simply gotten lost and nothing more. That night, sleep was fitful. I kept waking up at odd noises. The sound of twigs snapping just outside the window, the creak of the porch under the weight of something heavy, and the occasional rustle of leaves that seemed too deliberate to be animals. I stayed awake long into the night, sitting by the stove, watching the darkness outside. I had a small lantern and a pocket knife at my side. Every time the wind shifted, I imagined someone, or something, moving through the trees. The following day, I stayed inside the cabin almost entirely. I brought food and water inside and avoided looking out the windows for long stretches. The feeling of isolation had changed from peaceful to unnerving. Every small noise felt amplified. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming and serene the day before, now felt like a trap. I checked my phone constantly, but there was no signal. The thought of being completely cut off from the world pressed down on me with a weight I hadn't anticipated. Late in the afternoon, I decided to prepare for the night. I gathered all the firewood I could find, made sure the stove was stocked, and blocked the doors with whatever I could. I even moved the table to one side, positioning myself in a spot where I could see every window. The sound of the wind outside made the cabin groan and shudder, each creak echoing like a warning. I couldn't help but feel that if anyone or anything wanted to get in, it could. The rational part of my mind told me that nothing had happened, that the forest was full of deer, raccoons, and maybe the occasional wandering hiker. But my gut refused to be reassured. Night fell again, and the darkness was thick. I kept the stove burning and sat on the floor near it, watching the fire flicker. At some point, I realized that the noises outside had stopped. The snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves, the faint hum of the wind, they were gone. The forest was unnervingly silent, as if it had collectively paused to listen. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. Then, a soft scratching sound started at the back of the cabin, near the kitchen door. It was slow, deliberate, and rhythmic. I froze. I grabbed the knife, straining to hear more. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again, moving along the wall. I spent the rest of the night in a state of high alert, holding the knife and trying to ignore every creak, every gust of wind, every shadow. Morning came, and the sunlight through the windows brought a small measure of relief. Exhausted and tense, I stepped outside cautiously. The clearing was empty, the forest serene once more. There were no footprints, no broken branches, no signs of anything unusual. I convinced myself I had imagined the noises, that my fear and exhaustion had created them. I spent the next 2 days packing up, planning to leave as soon as possible. The forest had lost all its charm. Every step outside the cabin felt like venturing into danger. When I finally drove away, the sense of relief was overwhelming. The city noise returned gradually, but it no longer felt oppressive. Looking back, the experience taught me something about isolation and human perception. When you are alone in the wilderness, your mind begins to amplify small details, small uncertainties, into something threatening. The forest itself was harmless, but my fear had made it feel alive in ways it wasn't. And yet, the intensity of that fear, the way my senses sharpened, and the adrenaline kept me alert, is something I would never forget. I survived because I stayed cautious, stayed aware, and trusted my instincts. I realized that the wilderness is not magical, but it is dangerous in its own very real way, and the consequences of underestimating it can be severe. That trip, for all its terror, was also a reminder of my own resilience. I had faced real fear, had survived the disorientation, the isolation, and the relentless uncertainty. And when I returned home, I found a strange comfort in the mundane. Traffic, crowded streets, and the hum of electronics seemed safe now, almost luxurious in comparison to the raw, unfiltered solitude of the forest. Even now, years later, I remember the cabin vividly. The smell of damp wood, the cold bite of the autumn wind, the long shadows of the trees, and the endless, suffocating silence that made every sound feel like a warning. I have not returned, and I do not plan to. Some places, I realized, are better experienced once, survived, and remembered, rather than visited again. The forest had tested me, and I had emerged intact, but the memory of that fear remains as sharp as the first night I spent alone, listening to the wind and imagining the forest around me was alive. I never planned to stay in a cabin that far into the woods alone, but I was desperate for solitude. The city had become unbearable with its noise, people, and constant demands. I wanted nothing more than to disconnect, to feel the quiet of the forest and the weight of the air untouched by exhaust fumes and sirens. The cabin was an old rental I had found through a small website, almost like a hidden listing, the kind of place people never talked about publicly. It was deep in a state forest, miles from the nearest town, and even further from neighbors. The owner had been brief over the phone, warning me to bring supplies and that the road was rough past a certain point, but he had assured me it was safe. It seemed perfect at first glance, the kind of isolation I craved. The drive-in was long and nerve-wracking. The road was nothing more than a narrow path of gravel and dirt, winding between dense trees whose branches almost touched the car's roof at points. There was no cell signal, and even GPS flickered in and out. By the time I arrived, the sky was low and gray, and the sun had begun to fade behind thick clouds, casting the forest in a gloomy half-light. The cabin itself was rustic but solid, wooden, darkened with age, with moss growing on the roof and around the base. There was a small stone chimney, a porch with a sagging railing, and a heavy wooden door that creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, faint smoke, and a dampness that hinted at winter leaks. Dust covered the shelves, and the furniture, though basic, was sturdy. I was alone, and the silence was absolute, except for the occasional groan of the wood settling or the wind brushing against the trees outside. I unpacked slowly, carefully placing my supplies on the counter and inspecting the small kitchen. There was a wood stove, a small sink, and some basic utensils. The bedroom was tiny, just enough room for a bed and a nightstand. A small bathroom had a shower with an old, finicky water heater. Everything seemed functional, though it bore the marks of years of wear and lack of attention. I decided to make a fire to take the chill off. As I stacked the wood in the stove and struck a match, the room immediately became warmer and more alive. Flames danced in the small stove, casting flickering shadows across the rough wooden walls. For a moment I felt at peace. That first night was quiet but tense. I woke several times to sounds outside, the rustle of branches, the snapping of twigs, and sometimes what sounded like distant footsteps on the gravel path leading to the cabin. I reminded myself it was the forest, that animals made noise all the time, and eventually I drifted back to sleep. When I woke in the morning, the sky was overcast, a heavy gray pressing down on the trees. I decided to explore the surrounding area, following a faint trail that meandered through the woods. Birds were scarce, and the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to swallow the sounds of life. Everything felt muted and oppressive, though it was still beautiful in its rawness. The trail eventually looped back to the cabin, but I took note of landmarks. A large fallen tree with exposed roots, a boulder shaped like a broken roof, and a narrow creek that ran parallel to the path. I thought it might be useful if I needed to navigate quickly in an emergency. The following days passed in a mixture of cautious routine and mounting unease. I chopped firewood, collected water from the creek after boiling it, and kept the cabin tidy. I noticed small things that unsettled me. Footprints in the dirt near the cabin that weren't mine. A broken branch near the porch, the feeling of being watched when I stepped outside. I tried to rationalize everything. The footprints could be animals or maybe hikers who had passed by during my absence. The broken branch could have been wind. Still, the sensation persisted. I began leaving my knife on the counter where I could see it, checking the locks on the door more often, and keeping the windows closed. The forest was quiet in a way that made my own presence loud, every snap of my boots or clink of utensils echoing in the still air. Then, on the fourth day, things escalated. I had gone out early, intending to gather firewood and perhaps catch a glimpse of wildlife at the creek. The morning was foggy, with a damp chill that seeped into my bones. As I walked, I noticed more footprints, larger, heavier than any deer or bear, and they seemed to come closer to the cabin. I froze, heart pounding, scanning the mist for movement. Nothing was visible, just the slow sway of tree branches and the occasional flicker of light through the fog. I shook it off, convincing myself it was my imagination, and carried on. But the feeling of being watched intensified. By the time I returned, the cabin seemed smaller, more confining. I double-checked the locks and leaned the axe against the wall where I could grab it easily. That night, the noises started. At first, it was subtle. Faint scraping against the walls, soft thuds on the roof, the sound of footsteps pacing around the cabin. I stayed still, straining my ears. Then I heard a heavier, deliberate knocking on the door, slow but insistent. My breath caught and I gripped the axe. I waited, listening. The knocking stopped. Silence fell again, broken only by the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin. I stayed awake the rest of the night, the flames in the stove almost hypnotic as I imagined someone outside, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. In the morning, I searched the area around the cabin. There were no footprints in the snow. Wait, it wasn't snow, it was wet soil. But the ground was muddied, trampled in ways that weren't consistent with normal animal tracks. Something or someone had been circling the cabin. Panic set in. I realized that I wasn't just imagining things, and that I had no reliable way to call for help. The nearest town was miles away, and even if I could reach it, I had no idea how long it would take someone to arrive. My sense of isolation turned into acute fear. Every shadow became a potential threat, every sound amplified. I began to plan, if someone tried to enter, I would defend myself. If they circled again, I would hide and wait for daylight. I felt trapped, aware that my dream of solitude had become a nightmare. Over the next few days, the stalking continued. I found signs around the cabin. Broken branches along the path, footprints near the windows, and once, a small rock thrown against the side of the cabin. No one was inside, but it was clear I wasn't alone. Sleep became impossible. I rationed food carefully, keeping the door locked and the axe close at all times. I even considered leaving, but the path was narrow, overgrown, and the fog made it impossible to see clearly. I was stuck, and every instinct screamed that moving outside could be deadly. The fear was suffocating, gnawing at my thoughts until they became loops of paranoia. I noticed the smallest details more vividly. A rustle in the leaves, a glint of sunlight on metal, the way the wind shifted branches in ways that almost seemed deliberate. Then, one afternoon, something broke the pattern. I was stacking firewood when I noticed movement just beyond the tree line. A figure crouched, half hidden, watching me. I froze, heart thundering, and slowly stepped back into the cabin, closing the door quietly. The figure didn't move at first, just stayed in the same position, like it was waiting. I watched from the window, unable to look away, and finally, after what felt like hours but was likely minutes, it retreated into the forest. I realized then that whoever or whatever was out there knew the cabin well. They had been observing me, learning my routine. The realization was chilling. I wasn't just in the woods. I was being hunted. Over the next 24 hours, I fortified the cabin as best as I could. I stacked furniture near the doors and windows, placed the stove near the entrance so I could grab it quickly, and kept all tools close. I scavenged branches and rocks outside, leaving some in visible positions as if I was prepared to fight. I slept in shifts, never fully resting, eyes darting to the shadows. The predator outside seemed to sense my vigilance, as the stalking noises became more sporadic. It was almost a game of patience, each side waiting for the other to falter. When morning came, I inspected the cabin again. The door had no visible damage, but the lock was scratched, small and shallow, as if someone had been trying to tamper with it. I realized then that this was no random intruder. Someone had been here before, had watched the cabin, and had returned. Panic mixed with anger, but I also realized I couldn't stay another night unprepared. I needed a plan. I spent the next few hours preparing. I found a clearing near the cabin where I could see anyone approaching from a distance. I reinforced the door further, creating a small barricade. I kept the hatchet and a small crowbar within reach. I also kept a large backpack ready with essentials: water, food, flashlight, and warm clothes. I needed to be ready to leave the moment the situation got worse. Night came again. I stayed near the window watching. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps on the porch. This time I was ready. I opened the door slightly, enough to swing the hatchet if necessary, and waited. The footsteps approached. I caught a glimpse of a figure moving in the dark. It wasn't an animal. It was human. I shouted and swung the hatchet, but the figure bolted, disappearing into the trees. I grabbed my backpack, locked the door, and decided that was it. I couldn't risk another night. I waited until first light and then left the cabin, taking care to mark my path and avoid getting lost. The hike back to the road was long and exhausting. Every sound in the forest set my nerves on edge, but I kept moving, determined. By mid-afternoon, I finally reached a small dirt road. I was lucky. A passing truck saw me and gave me a ride to the nearest town. I contacted the authorities and reported the incident, giving them the location of the cabin and a description of what had happened. They were skeptical at first, but they later sent a ranger to investigate. When I returned weeks later, they had found signs that someone had been living near the cabin, makeshift camps, hidden caches, and evidence that he had been watching the cabin for days, maybe weeks. They never caught him, but I was told he likely moved on after my departure. It took months before I could sleep normally again. I stayed away from remote cabins for a long time, terrified of encountering someone like that again. But I learned something important from the experience. Nature is beautiful, but it is also unpredictable, and human danger can lurk in the quietest places. I realized that fear is real, and survival requires constant awareness, preparation, and sometimes sheer luck. The cabin itself was left as it was, abandoned, a quiet testament to the events that had occurred. I never returned, and I never forgot the feeling of being watched, the sense of someone just beyond the trees, and the raw, unshakable fear of knowing that another human had entered my world uninvited, unseen, and unchecked. I can still remember that first night, the wind, the darkness, the silence, and how it changed me. I realized that the wilderness is not just about solitude and peace. It is also about respect, vigilance, and the understanding that you are never truly alone. Even when you are, there are others, sometimes human, sometimes animal, who share the space with you, and some of them have intentions that are anything but friendly. I learned to trust my instincts, to prepare for the worst, and to leave when the situation demanded it. The cabin, once a symbol of escape and peace, had become a place of terror, and walking away was the only way to survive. Even now, when I hear about remote cabins in the forest, I think back to that experience. I remember every detail, the floorboards, the scratches on the door, the footprints in the dust, and the figure disappearing into the trees. It shaped how I view isolation and safety. The woods can be silent, beautiful, and terrifying all at once, and the lesson I carry with me is that danger is often real, often human, and often closer than you ever expect. I had been planning this trip for months. I wanted a real escape from the city, a place where I could be alone with nothing but the forest, the wind, and my own thoughts. The cabin I rented was deep in the mountains, miles from any town or road. It was one of those old wooden cabins, weathered and slightly crooked, with a small porch that looked out over a clearing. The trees around it were thick, tall, and heavy with dark green needles. When I first arrived, the silence struck me. There were no birds singing, no distant cars, no hint of people. It was a quiet that pressed on your ears, heavy and almost alive. I carried my bag inside, setting it down on the wooden floor, which creaked under the weight of my boots. The smell of damp wood and old pine was strong, mixed with a faint scent of smoke from the previous occupants. Everything in the cabin seemed to have a life of its own. The boards warped slightly as I walked, and small insects skittered across the corners of the ceiling. I spent the first day unpacking and exploring. The cabin was small but functional. A single room with a stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a bed that looked like it had been used for decades. There was a small bathroom with a cold water sink and a toilet that flushed sluggishly. The windows were large enough to let in sunlight during the day, but at night, they framed the darkness outside like a solid black wall. I unpacked my food and camping gear, stacked firewood in a neat pile near the stove, and made sure I had everything I needed for the night. That first night, I made a fire in the stove, its orange light flickering across the walls and the ceiling. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, sometimes hard enough to rattle the windows. I tried to sleep early, but the sound of the wind combined with the cracking of the wood and the occasional thump of something hitting the cabin roof kept me awake. I convinced myself it was just branches, squirrels, or birds. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell asleep, waking only a few times to the heavy sound of the wind. The next morning, I woke to the sound of quiet rustling outside. I thought at first it was a deer or maybe a fox. I ate breakfast, just some instant oatmeal and coffee, and decided to explore the woods near the cabin. I packed a small day pack with water, snacks, and a flashlight just in case. The forest was dense. The paths were mostly animal tracks, and I had to push through branches and underbrush to move forward. I saw evidence of wildlife everywhere. Paw prints, broken branches, and even a few tufts of fur caught in the bark of trees. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Birds and insects seemed to fade away, and the forest became a heavy, dark green tunnel. By midday, I realized I had wandered farther than I intended. The cabin was nowhere in sight. I turned back, but the forest had shifted. Paths I thought I remembered looked different, and landmarks I had noticed before seemed oddly altered, twisted in shape by the density of the trees. As I walked, I felt a creeping sense of unease. Something about the forest was too still, too deliberate. It wasn't loud, but it felt like it was watching me. I kept moving, my pace quickening. I tried to remind myself that this was normal, that I was alone in the wilderness, and that animals lived here. But then I heard a sound that stopped me cold. A crunch, not like the soft snap of a branch under my foot, but heavier, deliberate, and somewhere behind me. I froze, listening. The forest was silent again. I couldn't tell the direction of the sound, but I had the undeniable sense that it wasn't natural. My heart began to pound in my chest. I decided to move faster, pushing through the underbrush, trying to keep calm, trying to focus on anything else. When I finally saw the clearing where the cabin should have been, relief hit me hard. But as I approached, I noticed something was wrong. The front door of the cabin was slightly ajar, even though I had locked it. The firewood I had neatly stacked the day before was scattered across the porch. My stomach dropped. I stepped inside carefully. Everything looked normal inside, but there were signs that someone else had been here recently. Small footprints in the dust on the floor, faint and smudged, led from the door to the stove and back. I swallowed hard and told myself I must be imagining it, that maybe I had left the door unlocked when I unpacked. But the footprints, they weren't mine. I double-checked the windows and found nothing broken. The cabin was locked tight. Whoever had been here had entered and left without leaving a mark on the exterior. I spent the rest of the day on edge. I didn't leave the cabin. I checked the surrounding area from the windows, but the forest was dense, hiding everything beyond a few meters. At night, I made sure the door was locked and the fire was going. I kept a hatchet next to me just in case. Sleep was nearly impossible. Every creak, every scratch from the roof or walls made me sit up and stare into the darkness. I could hear the wind outside, but now it seemed to carry other sounds. Faint movement, the rustle of something large moving through the underbrush. I stayed awake most of the night, holding the hatchet in my hands. I kept telling myself it was an animal, that no human could get here unnoticed, but part of me refused to believe it. The next day, I considered leaving, but the nearest road was miles away, and the forest had a way of confusing paths. I didn't want to risk getting lost, so I decided to stay and be vigilant. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin as best I could. I piled extra logs against the door, checked the windows, and even barricaded the porch with furniture. I also tried to make a plan in case someone tried to get in. I moved items like knives and axes closer to me, keeping them within reach. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me, but every time I looked, there was nothing. Just trees, shadows, and the shifting light. By the third night, my nerves were raw. I barely slept, staying awake in the dark, fire burning low, listening. At some point, I heard something different. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, careful. I froze. My first instinct was to hide, but there was nowhere to hide. I gripped the hatchet tightly and stayed in the center of the room, breathing quietly, listening. The footsteps paused near the door. I could hear a faint scraping sound, as if someone was testing the lock. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I waited, ready to swing, ready to defend myself. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Finally, the footsteps retreated, fading into the forest outside. I stayed awake until dawn, too scared to sleep.